Chapter 341, Butterfly. Night had fallen deep. The moonlight could not pierce through the thick clouds. On a cliff some distance from Saul and the others, a light flickered to life. It came from a decrepit lighthouse. No one knew who still lingered alone by the sea, casting a lone, steady beam of safety over the pitch-black waters. Saul continuously shifted his position, keeping himself standing where the seawater just barely covered his ankles. From time to time, he extended his soul metamorph into the water using Touch of Torment, probing for the concentration of soul fragments and any other anomalies. Occasionally, pale arms lacking in self-preservation would reach out to touch him, only to end up making a negligible contribution to Saul's soul energy reserves. After Saul rejected their cooperation, Andy and Parker quickly left the shoreline, retreating to the shadows beneath the cliff. Their figures flickered in and out of sight, seemingly protected by some form of spell. All three were waiting for the appearance of the soul tide. According to the locals, before every soul tide, the sky would turn oppressively gloomy and fierce winds would tear across the sea. When the surface of the water began to fill with countless blurry human shapes, that was the sign that the soul tide had arrived. The seawater would grow warm, but clothes soaked in it would become all the heavier. Heavy breathing would echo beside the shell pickers standing in the sea, and if they dared to unwrap the black cloths from their faces, they would discover that the ones breathing were actually schools of fish rising from the depths. Fish, which normally couldn't breathe on the water's surface, would rise upright, poking their mouths out of the waves, gazing longingly at the starry sky, and making hakai sounds, as if the undead of the deep sea were yearning for air. At this moment, if a shell picker failed to escape in time, fleeing to the shore and then far inland, they would slowly begin to be assimilated by the surrounding fish. Their heads would tilt upward, their mouths gape wide, breathing faster and faster, while the air in their lungs grew ever thinner. Eventually, dazed and delirious, they would follow the fish without looking back, plunging deep into the ocean, never to be seen again. Tonight, the winds by the sea were indeed strong, and the night unusually dark. Perhaps the soul tide was on the verge of arriving. The local shell pickers had already left the beach completely before nightfall set in. As far as the eye could see, only Saul and the other two apprentice wizards remained. Yet the three of them waited with entirely different states of mind. "You're nervous. What did you see just now?" Shrouded in the shadows of the cliff, their figures hidden from outside sight, Parker finally spoke to Andy, who was still trembling. "Saul's mental power is so strong. I've only ever felt pressure like that from true wizards." Parker's brows furrowed slightly, then relaxed. "Sounds about right. Jiro said something similar. Did he detect your probing?" "Probably not. Even many true wizards can't sense my methods." "Your reconnaissance ability is unusual." The two continued to watch the sea, occasionally glancing at Saul from the corners of their eyes. "Why do you think he insists on standing in the water like that? Doesn't it bother him?" Andy scratched the skin behind her ear. "Intelibit IA. La inteligencia artificial que acierta el 80% de sus pronósticos. I suspect he's testing something through the seawater. Those apprentices backed by powerful masters really do have all sorts of tricks. Who knows what treasures he's hiding?" Andy licked her lips, her voice growing colder. "Parker, could you take him?" "If it's just a fight, I have a 60% chance. If it's a fight to the death, he's done for," Parker said calmly. But before Andy could reply, he suddenly pinched her sharply on the butt. "But that's not what concerns me. Apprentices from the big factions, especially ones mentored by second-rank wizards like him, always carry life-saving trump cards. That's one thing. We have our cards too, but if he's carrying a tracking curse, we'd be in trouble." "A curse?" Andy looked up in surprise, scratching her neck again without realizing it. "I once accidentally saw a fight in a forbidden area, two people clashing, and one of them was also an apprentice of a high-ranked wizard. There were no other witnesses besides me, but I clearly saw it. After the killer succeeded, a shadow burst from the victim's body and burrowed into his. When we left the forbidden zone, the victim's master was already waiting outside and instantly picked out the killer. Only later did I learn that it was a type of tracking spell. Parker didn't elaborate on the killer's miserable end. Instead, he continued warning Andy. High-ranked wizards usually won't give their apprentices magic items too far beyond their level. It could backfire and harm them. But tracking curses are different. They're safe. They help protect the apprentice's life or their secrets. Andy pouted, as if watching a treasure chest grow legs and run away right in front of her. Especially after being so badly rattled by Saul's terrifying mental force, the memory of it left her feeling humiliated. Her urge to kill him only grew stronger, hopping to erase her shame. But hearing Parker's warning, she knew she'd never get the chance. What was she supposed to gamble that Gorsa didn't care about this genius apprentice's life? Everyone knew that was a losing bet. Got it. Andy reached for her backside again, feeling the spot where Parker had pinched her growing itchier. Just then, she suddenly turned her head to look ahead to the left. What is it? I think I just saw a butterfly fly past, but there's no way a butterfly would be here. I must have been seeing things. A butterfly? Parker scanned the area, finding only a few small flying insects. Could this be the onset of the consciousness disturbance field before the soul tide? But shouldn't it be fish, not butterflies? I'm probably just too nervous. Andy could no longer find any sign of the butterfly, and the itchiness on her skin was gone. Her mood immediately lightened, and she stopped thinking about the earlier conversation. She rested her head on Parker's chest, listening to his heartbeat. What's he doing now? Parker hadn't noticed Andy's flirtation. He'd been watching Saul from the corner of his eye the entire time. Saul suddenly stepped forward, walking into deeper water. Andy glanced over when she heard that, watching him stop once the waves reached his knees. She didn't think much of it. She chuckled softly. Don't tell me he's been charmed, that'd be embarrassing. The icy seawater pricked at Saul's calves. Though he couldn't hear the two apprentices' conversation, he knew they were definitely observing him. As for whether they were plotting something against him, that was another question. The smarter a person was, the more cautious they tended to be. And since Parker was acquainted with Jiro, he couldn't be too much of a fool. After one more test of the soul fragment density in the water, Saul suddenly spoke. What did you do to that Andy? A silver butterfly appeared in his vision, gently flapping its wings, gliding up and down. The biting sea wind couldn't move its fragile wings in the slightest. Brother Saul, she was probing you just now. HMPH thought she was being sneaky, but that thing stuck to your skin like slime. So gross. Saul stepped forward again, raising one hand. A pale yellow orb appeared just beneath the transparent surface of his palm. Earlier, the girl named Andy had been covertly observing him. The probe had been brief and disguised, made to seem subtle. But what she didn't know was that Saul's entire body had been altered by soul resin. His skin was extraordinarily sensitive to external probes, especially those carrying mental force. In the instant the shadow on the sea surface shattered, Saul had even managed to snatch a leftover trace from its retreat. He looked down at his palm, analyzing it with the knowledge he had acquired. Andy likely specializes in water element. She uses skin affinity to carry out concealed surveillance. Other than her spiritual connection to the target, this ability isn't anything special. Having largely figured out Andy's magic, Saul lost interest and lowered his hand. As his palm turned, the pale yellow was gradually consumed by a ghostly gray. Not a trace remained. By now, the seawater had reached above Saul's knees. The waves came layer after layer, as though trying to push him away. He stopped again to test the soul fragment concentration in the water. No difference from the shallows. Saul looked out toward the horizon. Suddenly, his body shot out of the water, pausing midair before shooting forward again. "Brother Saul, where are you going?" Penny, who had been playing in the waves, fluttered back into view. "Weren't you planning to wait by the shore for the soul tide?" The soul fragment concentration in the water hasn't increased for a long time. At this rate, the soul tide won't happen tonight. If I'm just going to waste the whole night waiting, I might as well go see for myself. Chapter 342, Scared Half to Death by a Fellow. The flight spell was a second rank magic Saul had learned in between his research on vessels. It was a highly practical auxiliary spell that almost every apprentice who advanced to the third rank would inevitably learn. Among all the third-rank apprentices Saul knew, nearly all of them had mastered it, except for Senior Byron, whose method of floating was uniquely bizarre. Saul's figure stayed steadily half a meter above the sea's surface, gliding forward at speed. However, since he hadn't fully mastered the spell, his flight path was mostly limited to straight lines. He flew far from shore, venturing into deeper waters. A thin fog had settled over the sea. The line between the night sky and the ocean had blurred entirely, making it feel as though Saul were gliding toward an infinite, bottomless black hole. The sound of waves lapping against the shore faded as he distanced himself, until the whole world seemed to fall into silence. North, south, east, west, up, down, left, right. It was as if he were the only one left in existence. Were it not for the occasional nightmare butterfly flitting past his vision, Saul might have genuinely believed he was the last person alive in the world. But now there was no such illusion, because the silver butterfly was still as chatty as ever. Brother Saul, there aren't many fish here." With no one else around, Penny's talkative nature became even more pronounced. Thankfully, her voice was sweet and pleasant, soft and cuddly like a little girl, not grating at all. "Brother Saul, if a soul tide appears later, are you going to inject the energy of the soul fragments directly into Herman's soul? He's going to go crazy." "Not directly," Saul replied. Of course, he'd filter the energy through the diary first, but there was no need to explain those details to Penny. He had already ventured far from the coastline. The figures on the shore were just vague specks now. This should be the place where the soul tide first appears. Fish drowning, the dead washing ashore. Saul looked down. Black tendrils emerged again, trailing from his robe into the sea and gently stirring the water. A few minutes later, he retracted the tendrils and flicked the water off his hand. The concentration of soul fragments isn't rising, it's dropping. With the current conditions, there's no way a large-scale wraith field could form. He glanced overhead. The clouds seemed close enough to press down on him. The sea wind blew so hard he couldn't even keep his hood up. Still, all the signs resemble the conditions where a soul tide is rumored to occur. So why is the concentration of fragments decreasing? As Saul puzzled over it, he suddenly felt something rising from below the water's surface. A vast wave of magical energy swept over him. Mientras unos loren, otros ganan. Discover in Telibisha. He immediately retreated 50 meters and activated soul armor. His eyes locked onto the sea below, trying to identify the source of the threat. Is this the vanguard of the soul tide? Then he vaguely saw something, a massive spherical object slowly floating upward. Its pace was sluggish, inching toward the surface. Since it wasn't attacking, Saul didn't move either. The sky was dark, and he could only make out a vague outline, about the height of a person with 4 tentacle-like limbs, thin and short compared to its bulbous center. A dark glow gathered in Saul's palm, ready to launch. Then the strange sphere finally surfaced, revealing its grotesquely stretched features. "Saul." The ball slowly rotated, twisted, purple-blue facial features turning toward him. Ugh. The dark glow in Saul's palm dissipated. He rubbed his nose and sighed deeply. "Senior, could you please not make yourself look like a monster?" The massive sphere began to shrink, gradually transforming from a ball into a person. The purple-blue discoloration faded from the skin, revealing a pale face underneath. Byron sat on the choppy sea, raised a hand and waved. He couldn't talk again. No doubt it was because he'd absorbed more wraiths. In order to prevent his body from bursting under the pressure, he had to remain silent for long periods. At the same time, he had to be careful not to get injured. Though Byron's skin had strong regenerative abilities, minor wounds weren't a concern. 5 minutes later, with little algae supporting Byron, the two of them landed on a massive reef far from the coast. The reef had a hollowed-out depression, clearly man-made and freshly carved within the past few days. "You've been here for a while already, haven't you, Senior?" Byron nodded. The moisture on his skin evaporated instantly. He then raised a hand and gestured 5. "Right, of course you'd come here to hunt wraiths. When you dove underwater just now, did you sense something unusual?" Byron gestured with his hands in a flurry. Saul studied his movements for a while. Thanks to years of working together, he could just about guess the meaning. "You're saying it's been like this for 5 straight days, but still no actual soul tide. You think something's wrong below the surface, so you tried diving down." "Penny, brother Saul, how did you even interpret all that?" Saul casually waved near his ear, like swatting a fly. "Did you discover anything, Senior?" Byron nodded. He'd indeed found something these past few days. He began sketching shapes in the air. "A ship," Saul deciphered, suddenly recalling Parker's invitation to join a team. "A ghost ship." But Byron shook his head. Saul turned to the ink-dark sea, his gaze slowly shifting below the waves. "A sunken ship." Byron first pointed at Saul, then gestured beneath the surface. Saul understood. He was being asked to dive down and take a look himself. "All right, I'll go check it out. You stay here and keep watch for me." He removed the cloak that might hinder his movement underwater, revealing a linen shirt and black pants underneath. "By the way, Senior, there are 2 rogue apprentices on the shore. 1 third rank, 1 second rank. Be cautious." That was Saul's way of acknowledging that the 2 apprentices weren't weak. Byron nodded. His body shrank down and tucked into the newly dug hole, then pulled Saul's black cloak over himself, becoming one with the reef. In the next instant, Byron concealed his magical presence completely. Saul lost all mental perception of him. Senior Byron's strength really has improved. Looks like his gamble to house a wraith within himself is paying off. Without further delay, Saul dove into the water head first. The moment he submerged, he activated soul armor. Black tendrils shot from the back of his neck, slicing through the water. Though little algae was an earth element creature, its origin from a swamp made it equally nimble in water. Saul felt like he was being pushed forward, hardly needing to exert any effort. All he had to do was steer from the front. Every now and then, a flash of silver darted past, Nightmare Butterfly's curious little shadow. There hadn't been much light above the sea to begin with, and the deeper he went, the darker it became. The water pressure began affecting soul armor. His magic consumption was increasing. Saul gauged how much longer he could stay submerged, then accelerated slightly, diving along the same path Byron had risen from. When all traces of light vanished from view, Saul prepared to spend extra magic to cast a few more light spells. But just then, a few faint white glimmers appeared before him. The lights grew in number, like fireflies hiding in the bushes at night. Startled by a sudden disturbance, they scattered all at once. The abyss before his eyes transformed into a galaxy. "So beautiful," His first reaction was awe, then came astonishment. These are all soul fragments. Chapter 343, Pollution and the Thread. So pretty, Brother Saul, slurp slurp, it looks so delicious. The moment the galaxy appeared, the nightmare butterfly flew straight back to Saul. Her usually sweet and charming voice now held a husky, obsessive tone. Saul found it strange. Wasn't the nightmare butterfly supposed to feed on dreams? After raising one, Saul had studied Haywood's research notes on nightmare butterflies. Sure enough, as Gorse's most accomplished apprentice, Haywood's conclusions were mostly spot-on according to Penny. One of them stated that a nightmare butterfly's diet wasn't what Saul had initially assumed, souls. It fed on dreams, with a particular fondness for memories. The more emotionally charged the dream or memory, the more power it offered to the butterfly. Thus, those who encountered a nightmare butterfly rarely met a good end. The more tragic the past, the deeper the fear, the more the nightmare butterfly could grow. By that logic, Penny was born for a villain's script. Had it not been for escaping Kismet's pursuit, she probably wouldn't have stayed obediently in a small town for so many years. Penny stuck with me ever since the diary caught her, so has she eaten during this time. Now that he thought back to Penny's voice, was she starving? Saul glanced at the silver wings of the butterfly, deciding to ask her about it later. For now, he continued toward the starlight-like soul fragments. He still didn't understand why these soul fragments glowed. That only made him more curious about what lay hidden beneath the sea. Behind the starlight was a faintly illuminated arch structure. Using the glow, Saul saw massive dragon bones and an overturned hull. This must be the sunken ship Byron had mentioned. As he moved closer, he brushed shoulders with the galaxy. Romantic notions were lost on Saul. He opened both arms, instantly transforming them into enormous transparent tentacles lined with suckers. He was embracing the galaxy, or rather devouring it. The white light, normally intangible, was swallowed the instant it touched the tentacles. The suckers transformed into greedy mouths, tongues flicking hungrily as they sucked in every soul fragment they could reach. No one had ever dared absorb soul fragments so crudely. Even the mad Byron had only dared analyze them cautiously. Direct absorption, out of the question. Unrefined soul fragments still contained remnants of their original owners, memories from life and death. Fragmented, sparse, but clinging like rot, impossible to scrape off. Unless one spent great resources to purify them, the fragments were useless. Intelibet IA. La inteligencia artificial que acierta el 80% de sus pronósticos. That's why so many fragments had piled up in the Wizard Tower's candle channels. Like a landfill, they could be recycled but at tremendous cost and effort. The gains didn't match the expense. But Saul was different. With the diary's purification ability, he could devour like a whale gulping plankton indiscriminately. The white soul fragments, once swallowed by his tentacles, became pure energy flooding his body. But with them came impurities. And this time, the diary didn't clean them up as usual. Before Saul realized what was happening, a violent shock locked him in place. It felt like someone had peeled back his skull and poured in heaps of shattered imagery. Countless jagged visions came with harsh, jarring sounds. Despair, sorrow, pain, rage, fear. To make matters worse, the visuals and sounds didn't even match, like a ghost film with gunfight music. It was chaos. The dissonance made Saul dizzy and nauseous. In an instant, he forgot where he was, what he was doing, what he had just been thinking, what he was looking forward to. After the initial daze came a surge of overwhelming fear, but even that barely brushed his mind before vanishing. What finally took over was a soul-wrenching loneliness. Loneliness, deathly silence. even more intense than when he had flown over the sea's surface, surrounded by only black, white, and gray. Saul's descent halted completely. The transparent tentacles, having absorbed the glowing fragments, began to glow themselves. But his soul armor, previously trembling under the water pressure, suddenly solidified. The surge of energy came with a crisis of consciousness. In the light, Saul faintly sensed the soul fragments were beginning to burrow into him on their own, amplifying the chaos in his mind. Image after image, sound after sound, cutting each other off. Saul's body froze like a statue while his mind churned violently. The madness of this massive soul fragment ingestion surpassed even his first reckless experiment in physical transformation. And yet, amid the growing pain, Saul gradually regained clarity. He should have been in agony, but strangely, his brain blocked out the worst of it. His eyes suddenly rolled back, visually detaching him from the world around him. Now he saw only the impurities from the soul fragments in his mind. The audiovisual chaos intensified. Seconds felt like centuries. Yet in that sharp clarity, Saul began to see a thread within the jumbled mess. A thread that connected it all. This line linked all the fragments together. In some deep, inexplicable way, Saul felt that if he could find the beginning of the thread and tug it lightly, he'd realize it was all part of an ordered pattern. The chaos was only a result of limited perspective. The sounds, the visions, the experiences of the dead were all laid out in sequence. And if Saul shook the thread, the things connected to it would play out as he wished. Now, amid the chaos, one thread became clearer and clearer before his eyes. Saul reached out, at least, in his mind he reached out, to touch that thread hidden within the tangled consciousness. He could almost grasp it. But just 1 millimeter from his fingertip, the sounds, the images, and the thread itself vanished in a blink. Saul snapped back to reality, finding himself still in the deep sea. His foot rested on the hull of the sunken ship, and one hand was reaching forward. All around him, glowing soul fragments still drifted like fireflies. Brother Saul, are you okay?" The silver butterfly flitted before his eyes, a note of concern in her voice. Little Algae, in its thruster form, also poked its head toward him and gently nibbled at his arm with its shark-like teeth. It, too, was trying to wake him up. Just as Saul was about to reassure the two little companions, he felt like his lungs were about to explode. The suffocating sensation hit him like a sledgehammer, drowning his mind in sheer panic. He had to surface. Wizard apprentices could hold their breath for a long time, but that didn't mean they didn't need to breathe. In fact, with their high energy consumption, they needed air even more. And now Saul, thrown into crisis, had reached the very limits of his endurance. He had to surface now. Again, the thought burned in his mind. But just as he prepared to kick off the ship and ascend, he felt an unusual magical fluctuation from beneath his feet. Saul looked down. In a single glance, he locked onto a few gray stones nestled between the rotting planks. They looked just like any other sea-bottom rocks, but Saul, with his keen mental senses, quickly identified the magical wave as coming from them. He pointed at the crevice. The nightmare butterfly looked confused, but little Algae immediately darted over. Its earlier concern now turned into raw biting power. Crunch! It swallowed the gray stones along with the surrounding decayed wood in one gulp. Then, without waiting for instructions, it transformed back into a thruster and shot Saul toward the surface. Cough, 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 cough. Though he had surfaced as fast as his body allowed, Saul still didn't make it in time. He choked hard on the bitter, salty seawater, a burning pain searing his throat and nose. At that moment, a beam of white light hit him, a zero-rank spell, minor healing. While treading water, Saul looked up to see Byron standing on a reef, frowning and watching him with concern. Saul wiped the water from his face and gave an awkward smile. Lost focus for a second. Almost got myself killed. Chapter 344. A New Discovery. Byron pulled Saul onto the shore. He noticed Saul's soul body and magic were both unstable, so he took the initiative to handle Saul's recovery. Hello? I saw that sunken ship, and those strange glowing soul fragments. Byron reached out his hand, and a transparent, narrow-necked vial appeared in his palm. Inside the vial swirled a white mist, with two glowing wisps drifting gently up and down. Saul looked at Byron's vial and silently held out his own hand. His arm hadn't deformed. It was still grayish-white and hadn't turned into a light source. I gathered a few too. That's why I took a bit longer. Byron nodded. This was a little heavier, as though warning Saul not to be so greedy next time. Saul actually still felt puzzled. Whenever he absorbed soul fragments, he was never affected by the impurities they carried. But this time, he'd been trapped for quite a while before escaping, as if the diary had deliberately delayed absorbing the fragments' impurities. Was it because there were just too many fragments this time? Maybe the diary hadn't issued a warning simply because Saul could endure it. At the time, I thought I saw a thread, but before I could touch it, the diary suddenly absorbed all the impurities. Was that intentional too? What was that thread? Had the diary deliberately stopped him from touching it? I get the feeling something terrible would have happened if I had touched it at least. The current me, clear-headed, would never poke it carelessly. Byron had no idea what Saul was thinking. He produced another vial, this one holding a thumb-sized gray stone. I found this too. Saul snapped his fingers. Little algae instantly darted over, opening its wide mouth to reveal a chaotic mess inside. Saul rummaged around inside and fished out two stones identical to Byron's. Holding them in his hand, Saul realized they looked like ordinary rocks, blending into the seafloor without drawing notice. But once in his hand, the stone felt soft, like rubber. Saul pressed lightly, and the gray stone cracked with a click. Yet before he could inspect the cross-section, both broken halves squirmed and reshaped themselves into irregular, vaguely spherical lumps. Not stone, not metal either. This is some kind of synthetic material. Definitely shows signs of artificial crafting. Byron nodded, having reached the same conclusion. But he seemed to have made another discovery as well. He opened the vial, poured one of the gray pellets onto a reef, then took out a bottle of red liquid and dropped a single droplet on it. The strange magic aura surrounding the gray substance vanished instantly. In its place, it emitted a wave of mental energy. Sensitive to mental force, Saul instinctively leaned closer. Intelibet IA. La inteligencia artificial que acierta el 80% de sus pronósticos. Intelibet IA. IA con 80% de aciertos en pronósticos deportivos. But the gray lump itself didn't change much. At that moment, Byron tapped Saul's shoulder, directing his gaze toward the ocean. Saul turned and saw the Black Sea glowing. At first 1 or 2 faint lights, then 5 or 6, eventually a whole cluster formed. Though not as many as near the sunken ship, it was still enough to illuminate a 10-square-meter patch of water around them. Drawn by some unseen force, the fragments drifted over, gathering near the reef. I've never seen anything that can attract soul fragments, Saul marveled. Then his eyes lit up. If this gray substance could attract soul fragments, could it be accepted by souls? If used as a vessel, or to improve a vessel, could it solve the problem of soul bodies not being able to remain in containers for long? Byron hadn't been involved in the resurrection experiments, but he clearly saw potential in this strange gray substance. When Saul looked up, he saw Byron staring at the sea, eyes gleaming with excitement. Saul rested his chin on his hand. Don't tell me you're thinking about fusing it into your own skin, Senior Byron. And so that night, two research maniacs dove again and again, collecting the gray material, surfacing only to breathe, then diving again. They'd completely forgotten why they'd come here in the first place. Unfortunately, the peculiar gray material was rare. After searching all night, even with their magic nearing warning levels, they'd only gathered a little. As the clouds in the sky slowly scattered, a soft morning light spread across the sea. The darkened ocean finally revealed its true colors. But amidst the blue remained streaks of gray, giving the water a vaguely oppressive look. Byron decided it was time to return. He couldn't wait to study this newfound gray substance. Saul had come here to replenish his soul fragments through the soul tide. Though he hadn't seen that bizarre tide this time, he had no regrets. Bluewater Bay would still be here. The tide wouldn't vanish. After a brief rest to restore their magic and mental strength, the two prepared to head back. Saul still had no idea how Byron, who hadn't learned flight, got here in the first place. But he wasn't eager to find out either. He had a feeling that knowing might chip away at his sanity, so he opted to fly himself and have little Algie carry Byron along. It just cost him a bit more magic. When Saul spotted the coastline, he specifically looked toward the cliff where Parker and Andy had been hiding. To his surprise, that cliff had collapsed. Their hiding spot was now a tall mound of dirt. Only faint traces of blood lingered, enough to suggest they'd been injured, but had gotten away alive. They left. Byron's expression grew serious as he analyzed the shape and impact of the landslide, trying to deduce the method and force of the attack. Saul kept a sharp watch on their surroundings, eyes scanning every possible ambush point. A little girl's giggle echoed in his mind. Saul instantly understood. Andy and Parker must have been tripped up by a little trick the nightmare butterfly had left behind. And it looked like they got tripped badly. "Senior, I think the enemy's gone. Let's leave too." Byron nodded in agreement. The two cloaked themselves and left quietly. Soon after they departed, the sun rose fully. Bluewater Bay no longer seemed so dangerous. Occasionally, a few fishermen would set out while the tide was calm, or scavenge seaweed and shells from the reefs. But delicacies like black sea snails never appeared in broad daylight. Otherwise, people who harvested them wouldn't be considered disposable. The coastline of Bluewater Bay began to stir with faint activity. Of course, that so-called bustle was only an upgrade from empty to 3 or 4 figures. At that moment, a middle-aged man in a wrinkled formal suit, carrying a massive luggage trunk on his back, stepped onto the beach. Sanders stood there, staring blankly at the vast, desolate sea beneath the lingering clouds, unable to come back to himself for a long time. His sister had died at Bluewater Bay Port. Racked with guilt, he had never returned since. But when he learned from a wizard that his sister hadn't drowned, but had her soul taken by the soul tide here, he rushed over at once. By the time he arrived, he'd nearly run out of money. Patting the trunk, Sanders said, "Don't worry, sis, I will find your soul." But first, he had to find a job here in Bluewater Bay to support himself. He swore this to the sea, then turned and headed for the town. As he walked, he saw a group of 5 or 6 children heading down toward the shore. The weather was growing cold and they were all underdressed. Huddled together, they whispered and giggled as they walked. The sea breeze carried snippets of their chatter. "Wizard, obedient, remember." Maybe one of the older brothers was telling them wizard stories, probably using them to scare the younger ones into behaving. Sander looked on enviously, gently stroking the trunk at his back. "Maybe we'll meet again, Midor." Chapter 345, The Reblooming Corpse Flower. The return trip wasn't on the same airship, and this new ship's captain clearly lacked Captain Harry's courage to strike up a conversation with 2 wizard apprentices. so the return journey was quite dull, especially since wizard students were strictly forbidden from conducting experiments on board. If they accidentally blew up the airship, the vengeful spirits wouldn't be able to touch them. But the major shareholder behind the ship, Baton Academy, would certainly send over a hefty bill. One so large even selling oneself wouldn't cover it. Even though Saul had the Tower Master of the Wizard Tower backing him, he didn't believe Master Gorsa, who barely cared if he lived or died, would pay the debt for him. So when it was time to act wild, he could act wild, but when it was time to behave, better hold it in. With nothing else to do, Saul told Byron about the rumors he'd heard from Captain Harry about Baton Academy and their new-style products. Byron listened with shining eyes. From the looks of it, his wallet was going to suffer another hemorrhage soon. After returning to the Wizard Tower, Saul immediately picked out a new body for Herman from the corpse horde. The female corpse that had caused the earlier screeching had been confirmed as contaminated and was already sent to the corpse room. Just like with the soul infusion experiment, Herman could only inhabit female corpses aside from his original body. If he entered a male corpse, Herman's consciousness would immediately suffer violent rejection, and there were even faint signs of contamination. Fortunately, there were no abnormalities this time when Herman entered a new female body. Many of Saul's preemptive preparations turned out to be unnecessary. Just as Herman was slowly adjusting to the new body and starting to move again, Hayden arrived, having heard Saul had returned. When Saul brought Hayden into the second storeroom, Hayden immediately spotted the woman walking slowly inside. But this time he didn't greet her with the same warmth as last time. In fact, he was downright cold. Herman, who had just raised a hand to wave, was left in an awkward pose. He tried to twist his wrist and turn the wave into a face scratch, but he still couldn't perform delicate movements, so the face scratch turned into smack. Herman slapped himself in the face. Piwedahasa. No doubt about it, that wild laugh had to be Penny. If it had been little Algie, the laughter would have sounded like plub plub plub. This trip outside had yielded good results, and with Herman's experiment progressing smoothly, Saul was in a great mood. He smiled as he introduced, "This is Ammon." He had originally intended to say it was still Herman, but worried that if Hayden found out the truth, the mental blow might be too great and lead to contamination. So he opted for a kind lie. Mientras unos Lauren, otros ganan. With Saul's introduction, Hayden gave a stiff, expressionless nod to Herman. Herman blinked his hollow eyes, pretended he still couldn't fully control his body, and slowly turned his head the other way. Ignoring the awkward atmosphere between them, Saul called both Herman and Hayden over to the lab table to continue recording data. "Let's continue. Ammon, when you entered the vessel, aside from the save me cry, did you hear any other voices, see or sense anything unusual?" "And no, sir. The tongue of this new body wasn't quite working right, so Herman quickly copied Hayden's way of addressing Saul. Saul then turned to ask Hayden, but just like before, Hayden had no memory of anything unusual when first entering the new body. Even so, Saul gained many new ideas and planned to test them all starting tomorrow. Especially with the new gray substance he'd found, which he'd named gray matter. Looked like he'd be quite busy again for a while. Unexpectedly, Hayden asked for leave after hearing Saul's plans. "I'm very sorry, Lord Saul. Mentor Rum asked me to come in tomorrow morning for a routine checkup." "Routine checkup?" Saul flipped through the soul infusion experiment notes in his memory. Indeed, that was a listed procedure, though like the initial vessel reaction logs, it was considered peripheral information and often overlooked. What exactly gets checked during a routine inspection? Do they check for vessel and soul rejection? Saul was intrigued and decided to tag along tomorrow. That night, after much traveling and work, Saul finally returned to his dorm for a rare night of rest. Next door, Kelly's door was still locked. She was clearly still in the Black Castle, working on her radioactive toxin research. Who knew how it was going? When would she be back? While Saul could contact her via letters at the registry, the cost, yeah, kind of steep. No need to chat casually that way. If Kelly needed anything, she'd reach out herself. That girl never held back with Saul, and he'd never let her down either. After a good night's sleep in his dorm, Saul woke at dawn just as the dim yellow candlelight shifted into bright white. He glanced at the Los Angeles 6:00 sharp. Today Hayden would be visiting Mentor Rum. Since Saul had never seen Rum perform a soul infusion experiment, he wanted to tag along. Maybe he'd spot something he'd previously missed. Saul left his room almost exactly at 6, only to find that several other dorm doors were also opening. Clearly, many second-rank apprentices were fiercely competing for every second. A slightly older apprentice across the hall saw Saul, blinked, then politely greeted him. Senior Saul. Saul's gray-white skin was now widely recognized in the Wizard Tower, and with Gorsa publicly accepting him as a disciple, even some third-rank apprentices would now greet him respectfully. If Saul didn't spend all his time holed up in the second storeroom, he'd probably be mobbed daily. He nodded to the second-rank apprentice, who was nearly twice his age, and briskly headed toward the East Tower. But today, the West Tower had another chaotic morning. As Saul reached the 10th floor of the West Tower, about to pass through the corridor that led to the East Tower, he saw a crowd gathered near the passage. Wizards generally didn't like crowds, so if this many people had gathered, something must have happened. Most likely, someone else had died. Though Saul didn't often wander the tower, his department was closest to the corpse room, so he was well aware of how many students died each month. Even though this kind of thing was common, Saul still instinctively glanced into the crowd as he passed. That one glance brought his hurried steps to a halt. Another male servant had died in the corridor. He was young, Saul even recognized him. They had once lived together in a shared dorm hall. Now he had been made into a flower. Limbs for petals, head for blossom. A corpse flower. Saul frowned and looked again, then continued on his way. The original perpetrator behind the corpse flower incidents was Angela. She obtained the ritual of Bitchai somehow, and in pursuit of greater magic power and dark affinity, had committed several murders. But Angela had already died at Billy's hands. Her accomplices were also locked away by Saul. Who else could know Bitchai's sacrificial rite? Within his mental space, the diary flipped open, revealing a black page that belonged to N. Saul asked in his mind, "Was it you who taught Angela how to make dead man's flowers to boost her magic?" Chapter 346, Rust. It was actually Lokai. Saul was somewhat surprised, then felt a sense of inevitability. Between you and Lokai, who approached Angela first? Lokai had contacted her before I possessed Angela. However, when he came to her again, it was I who persuaded her to accept Bitchai's sacrificial rite. Why, did you gain something from the rite? I had just escaped from the interlayer and was extremely weak. I needed energy. Besides, to survive, I had fused a part of myself with Angela, so her getting stronger was important to me too. Lokai would never offer benefits for free. Just like how he founded and maintained the mutual aid, there had to be some ulterior motive behind it. What price did you pay to receive Bitchai's sacrificial rite? All byproducts of the rite were handed over to a first-rank apprentice. But I'm certain those things all ended up in Lokai's hands eventually. That Saul could believe. The higher-level meetings of Lokai's mutual aid were meant to help senior apprentices exchange items and share information. But as the organizer, Lockeye would undoubtedly reap a wealth of benefits and intelligence. That's the power of a platform. Meanwhile, low-level members of the mutual aid were easily turned into raised goose specimens or disposable pawns. Kelly had once been implanted with a parasite. The weak Jenna had even died in front of Saul due to a worm goo. Although Seed had eventually stepped up to take responsibility for Jenna's death, Saul now suspected that Lockeye's hand might not have been absent from that matter either. And the one who ultimately closed the net around Angela was Billy. Is Billy one of Lockeye's people too? Being able to manipulate a third-rank apprentice, this mutual aid might be even more influential than I imagined. And now, clearly, Lockeye had caught himself another new prey. Stripping soul bodies, creating vengeful, Saul's footsteps suddenly halted. Even the wandering wizard in Grind Sail Town got his hands on a vengeful spirit-creating formation. I saw an advanced version of it at that lakeside cabin. What Saul couldn't understand was, Lockeye clearly specialized in the earth element. So why was he always involved with dark element rituals, formations, and magic? Next time I head out, I need to check that lakeside cabin more carefully. There might be something I overlooked. Saul was walking with long strides and a fast pace. Deep in thought, he quickly reached the 16th floor of the East Tower, where Mentor Rum resided. As soon as he entered the corridor, Saul spotted Hayden packing nervously. She was rubbing her hands gently, looking anxious. When Saul appeared, Hayden let out a long sigh of relief. "You look so scared, I thought you were going to make him come out." Saul walked over, and the two continued toward Mentor Rum's quarters. Hayden still trailed half a step behind Saul, even though he had never asked her to. In the quieter living quarters of the Mentors, Hayden also lowered her voice. He said, "If I keep avoiding it, the corruption will come faster. El futuro de los pronosticos y ligo. Miles de datos un solo objetivo, que gains más. Esa es la nueva era de los pronosticos." Her second personality seemed more perceptive than the primary one. Avoidance was definitely not the best solution. Although sometimes it worked. The door to Mentor Rum's room was slightly ajar. Outside stood a male apprentice. He, like Hayden, had blonde hair and blue eyes. Now Saul understood. This was entirely due to Mentor Rum's personal aesthetic. All the soul infusion vessels were cosmetically altered to match his preferences, just to avoid unnecessary trouble. They waited about 15 minutes outside the door before a voice came from within. "Next." The gap in the door widened, and a slender girl stepped out. Her hair fell over most of her face, and her beautiful features looked gloomy. The male apprentice at the front immediately entered the room. Taking advantage of the changeover, Saul also walked up to the door. But just as he raised his hand to knock, he heard another mentor's voice from inside. "Is that you, Saul, coming too?" It was Mentor Kaz. Why was he here as well? Saul followed inside. The second-rank apprentice ahead of him stiffly twisted his neck 90 degrees, then froze in place. Only after Saul passed him and lifted the heavy curtain to enter the inner room did the apprentice start moving again. As Saul stepped into the partition, a beam of sunlight dazzled his eyes. The window in Mentor Rum's room was open only a crack today, but the sunlight outside was exceptionally bright. A shaft of light streamed in like a sword, piercing the darkness. Through the beam, Saul saw Mentor Kaz and Mentor Rum. Mentor Rum was still a mountain, even more massive than the last time Saul had seen him. The fat on his back had risen so high it now towered above his head. "How's your experiment coming along? What are you standing there for? Get up there and lie down." The latter part was directed at the apprentice, who had come in behind Saul. "I still have a lot of confusion, so I came to learn from you." You're already able to conduct soul infusion experiments independently. There's not much more I can teach you. Like I said before, you're welcome to come watch anytime. If you can spot something I missed, all the better. But let's begin. Mentor Kaz doesn't have much patience. Mentor Rum seemed to be in a good mood. He chuckled heartily. Though his mouth was obscured by fat, it was hard to tell if he was actually smiling. Saul watched the male apprentice remove his outer robe, leaving only his shorts, and quickly lie down on the cold experiment table. Saul, observe for now. You'll take over in a bit. Let's see how much of your corpse room skill you've retained. Mentor Kaz's voice was as hoarse and commanding as ever. He was rarely seen without his long robe, but today he wore a form-fitting black outfit, rubber gloves on his hands, surgical gear. Laid out before him was a set of dissection tools, scalpels, needles, clamps, forceps, all glinting coldly. Understood, Mentor. Saul stood behind Kaz, watching as he swiftly sliced through the male apprentice's arm from shoulder to wrist. The wound split open instantly due to skin contraction, like jelly being cut. The blood wasn't much, and it was thicker than a normal person. Saul had made similar incisions on Hayden before, so he wasn't unfamiliar with the phenomenon. But what surprised him was Kaz's next move. He switched to a different pair of forceps and began probing deep within the wound, as if searching for something. Saul lowered his head, following the forceps tip with his eyes. He saw Kaz quickly extract something from the muscle and toss it into a nearby tray. Glancing toward the tray, Saul saw an irregular black-white-gray stone, something like a calcified mass. Before Saul could even figure out why such a thing would appear inside the vessel's body, Kaz had already thrown in a second similar chunk. About 5 minutes later, another 7 or 8 had been retrieved. Then Kaz casually tossed aside the forceps. Saul, you take over, don't forget the gloves. Saul hurried over, pulled a fresh pair of gloves from the side of the table and put them on. Then, mimicking Kaz's posture, he picked up the forceps. In the corpse room, Saul had rarely worn gloves while harvesting materials. This time, Kaz had specifically instructed him to wear them, likely to protect the experiment subject, who could still barely be considered alive. Meanwhile, Kaz hadn't stopped either. He moved to the other side and cleanly cut open the subject's other arm. Saul didn't watch him. He lowered his gaze, eyes narrowing. Half-immersive meditation mode activated. Tiny white points of light appeared in the wound, so many that it was unsettling. Can you see a lot of them? Rum's voice floated over, low and distant. Just pick out the ones over 2 millimeters in diameter. And the rest? Just leave them there. Saul had a vague guess as to what those small stones were. They were impurities, byproducts of the composite body created by Rum and the other mentors. This man-made body, due to various defects, would develop internal flaws, like metal rusting. An internal decay that would eventually destroy the vessel completely. If every soul-infused vessel had to undergo regular maintenance, did that mean that all soul-infused vessels would rust? Chapter 347, he'll tell you. Although Saul had long known that these artificially synthesized soul vessels couldn't possibly be as stable as naturally formed bodies. If they were producing this much rust, didn't that mean every single test subject actually had a very limited lifespan? What are you spacing out for? Get to work, Kaz's hoarse voice came from the side. Saul quickly lowered his head, suppressing the sigh in his heart, and began carefully picking out the rust. Kaz stared at Saul for a while. Once he was sure the latter was doing it correctly, a look of satisfaction flickered in his eyes, and only then did he continue inspecting the rest of the body. Kaz, look at Saul. He's just as efficient as you now. Rum stretched his neck and watched Saul's rust picking, while still taking the chance to poke fun at Kaz. HMPH, then why aren't you working? There are 4 to handle today, this is only the second one. Rum wasn't offended. He extended his triple-jointed arm, with 2 elbow joints and 10 nimble, slender fingers, gently placing them on top of the male apprentice's head. Saul's gaze was immediately drawn over. He then saw Mentor Rum. Whether he had touched something or activated something, it wasn't clear, but the next moment, Rum lightly lifted off the experiment subject's skull cap. The powerful sense of déjà vu made Saul instantly recall that scene he had once witnessed on Little Algie. Back then, Lady Yura had also had her skull cap gently sliced off by Gorsa from behind. Saul's hands paused mid-motion. This time, Mentor Kaz didn't urge him to continue. Saul's eyes landed on the exposed edge of the experiment subject's skull, and he saw that there was no brain inside, but rather a clump of whipped cream-like foam. After the skull was lifted, that cream foam inside continued to change. Old bubbles were constantly bursting, and new ones kept forming. When Rum saw the cluster of white foam, the smile on his face gradually disappeared. Even less now. Should be usable for 3 or 4 more times. Mentor Rum dripped a few drops of potion into the male apprentice's brain, using his nimble fingers, ran some other checks with different tools, and finally reassembled the skull with precision. Too bad the Tower Master no longer trades with the land drifters. Otherwise, the thousand-eyed Banshee's eyes would have been a better substitute for brain matter. Kaz didn't even look up, but it also loses control more easily. Hearing this, Saul, who was focused on his work, suddenly blinked. He thought of someone. After quickly checking the skull and limbs, the mentors didn't touch the torso. That part held the experiment subject's soul, sealed by a sorceress formation, not something they'd casually interfere with. Rum only briefly checked the formation's stability, and then withdrew his hand. At that point, Saul and Kaz had just finished cleaning 1 arm and 1 leg each. "Not bad, your efficiency really has improved," Rum nodded, his cheerful expression returning. Once the body's external wounds were repaired, the male apprentice lying on the experimental table was awakened. He stood up with a dazed expression, as if he had only taken a short nap. "El futuro de los pronosticos ya ligo." Mentor Rum tested a few movements, and then waved for him to leave. Just as the apprentice bowed his head in salute and prepared to leave, Rum suddenly said in a low voice, "Today is your last regular inspection. You don't have to come back anymore." The male apprentice, just having bent into a deep bow, froze on the spot. After a full 5 seconds, he raised his head in disbelief. Mentor Rum, but this is only my 3rd inspection." His disbelieving expression was formed by slightly widened eyes and trembling lips. That was the emotional limit of a test subject with facial paralysis. But Rum didn't offer much explanation. He just waved his hand. "Go, from now on you can inspect yourself." Inspect himself, self-dissection. The male apprentice seemed like he wanted to ask something more, but Mentor Rum clearly didn't want to hear another word. The apprentice could only walk out filled with reluctance and confusion. Now he finally understood why the first female apprentice had looked so grim when she left. But as soul infusion test subjects, they were first-rank apprentices who had no hope of advancement. They had no power to resist, not even the freedom to choose their future path. The male apprentice moved more stiffly than when he had arrived. As he left, Mentor Rum loudly called out, "Next." Hayden, bearing the outer shell of Vessel 147, quickly walked in. Although she also had a paralyzed face, Saul, having spent more time with her, could detect a hint of confusion in her slightly flickering eyes. Next, Hayden went through the full regular inspection process. Once her body was treated and she stood up again from the table, she heard the bad news, personally spoken by Mentor Rum. But unlike the others, Hayden instinctively looked at Saul. Saul gave a subtle nod but said nothing. Hayden looked slightly uneasy, but her expression was clearly not as grim as the previous two apprentices. She didn't even plead. When Mentor Rum first motioned for her to leave, she turned and walked out of the room. After the final apprentice of the day left Rum's room with a disappointed look, Rum casually tossed aside the various instruments, turned his head, and said to Saul, "Looks like your experiment's going pretty well." 147 trusts you so much that she didn't even panic after hearing about the inspection termination. When Mentor Rum stopped the regular inspection of a vessel, it basically meant abandoning the soul infusion experiment. And right now, Saul had little confidence that he could continue Hayden's progress alone. Hayden had probably assumed Saul could independently carry out the soul infusion experiments after seeing him create new test subjects. But she didn't know that Saul's situation with Herman was completely different. Still, Saul remained calm. If he truly had no other options, he could consider converting Hayden into a book page. Of course, unlike the others, Saul would give Hayden a choice. This matter could wait until they got back. Saul shook his head, not acknowledging that he had the ability to protect Hayden. She's just fearless because she's ignorant. Ignorant and fearless. Rum laughed when he heard this. The fat on his face visibly jiggled with amusement. Even Kaz, who had been quietly tidying up, couldn't help glancing up at Saul. "I've heard you're good at saying some interesting things." Kaz finished packing. With a flick of his wrist into his sleeve, the big bundle of tools vanished, clearly a space compression item. Saul had bought a similar one on the airship recently, so he wasn't surprised. Anyone can say things like that. But how many truly realize their own ignorance? Used to mentor Kaz's sarcasm, Saul simply gave a slight bow. Then he looked toward Rum. "Mentor Rum, why terminate the regular inspections so suddenly? Does this mean the soul infusion experiments are being stopped?" "Not stopped, but ended," Mentor Rum replied cheerfully. "Right now, the resurrection experiment has a new breakthrough. The Tower Master wants us to focus all our energy on the new experiment. Since soul infusion has had no progress, it naturally has to end." Mentor Rum didn't tell Saul what the new breakthrough was. Mentor Kaz didn't mention it either. It was as if they were deliberately trying to pique Saul's curiosity, dropping a small hint, then sealing their lips. Seeing Saul, for once, show a flustered expression befitting a 15-year-old boy, Mentor Rum laughed heartily. "Haha, don't worry. Even if we don't tell you, you can always ask your Tower Master." But when he got to that part, Rum's voice suddenly dropped an octave, becoming solemn. "If your Tower Master thinks it's something you should know, he'll tell you." Chapter 348, Come Take It. The temperature in the room plummeted. The warm and pleasant atmosphere from just moments ago shattered like glass, revealing the truth beneath. Saul froze for a second, instinctively turning his head to look at Mentor Kaz. But Mentor Kaz remained silent, expressionless. Only then did Saul realize, while Mentor Rum had been in a good mood throughout the conversation, Kaz hadn't smiled once. In fact, there was a simmering restlessness about him. Something must have happened, something I don't know about. Saul withdrew his gaze, bowed respectfully to both mentors, and left Mentor Rum's room. Even after he stepped through the door, not a single word passed between the two mentors behind him. Something definitely happened. Why won't they tell me? Or is it that only Master Gorsa is allowed to? Hayden was waiting for Saul on the ramp of the East Tower's 16th floor. But when she saw him and greeted him, Saul didn't respond. He simply walked down with a heavy look on his face. That immediately made Hayden tense up as well. Though she had been surprised when the routine soul infusion checkups were suddenly canceled, she felt more at ease than the other test subjects. After all, Saul could perform soul infusion on his own. And when she saw Saul earlier, he had given her a calm nod, which had only reassured her further. But now, seeing him come out of Mentor Rum's room with such a grave expression, Hayden's heart gave a hard thump. Lord Saul, she jogged forward a few steps, catching up to him. Saul stopped walking, gathered his thoughts, and told her, "You should go back and rest for now. Your wounds may have healed, but it's still too soon to rejoin the experiments." "Okay," Hayden nodded repeatedly. "Also, review your skills from the corpse chamber while you're at it." Hayden blinked, her blank expression turning even more stunned. "Starting tomorrow, you'll be involved in the experimental tests on Ammon. You'll be responsible for observation and recording. I've got other matters to deal with." Hayden finally registered what he said, but unease crept across her face. "My hands might not be as steady as before." Saul nodded. "I know, but don't forget I didn't bring you along just to be a test subject. You've already lost your most precious thing. Don't let the second be wasted too." With that, he didn't wait for the stunned Hayden and quickly descended the tower. Hayden remained where she was, whispering to herself, "The second Lord Saul must mean the skills I developed over 10 years in the corpse chamber." But what was the first precious thing? No matter how long she thought, she couldn't figure it out. Saul had sent Hayden away not just to process the conversation with the mentors, but also because he wanted to find someone. Mentor Rum had half-intentionally revealed that Soul Infusion once used the eye of the thousand-eyed banshee from the land drifters as material. But since Gorsa no longer traded with the land drifters, that material could no longer be obtained. Combined with Rum's sudden act of revealing the experiment subject's skull today, Saul immediately thought of Kanksha, the girl with only half a head, whose new skull was filled with eyes. Ever since she learned something about elves at the academic exchange, Saul had heard nothing more about her. But judging from Haywood's reaction when he tried to stop her, Kanksha had likely gone off to do something very dangerous. Whether she succeeded or died out there remained unknown. Saul made his way easily to the second-rank apprentice dorms. He raised his hand and knocked loudly on Kanksha's door, thump, thump, thump. But after a moment, there was no response. Just then, a nearby door opened, and someone stepped out. The person looked up and saw Saul waiting at Kanksha's door. "Ah, Saul, Sr." The person seemed hesitant at first but still greeted him politely. Saul turned and saw a familiar face. Monroe, a second-rank apprentice who had mastered nearly every zero-rank spell and many first-rank ones as well. He still taught new apprentices the basics of understanding of all knowledge. Some first-rank students even called him a walking knowledge vault. But perhaps because he spread his energy too broadly across many fields, Monroe hadn't advanced in years. Aside from reading, he rarely joined other activities, making him nearly invisible among high-ranking apprentices. Saul, by contrast, had focused his efforts more narrowly, yet his progress was undeniable. Becoming a third-rank apprentice in just 3 years had already broken the Wizard Tower's record. Among apprentices, he was something of a legend. But Saul rarely interacted with other apprentices. He mostly saw corpses and mentors. Neither group showed much surprise at his rapid growth. Senior Monroe. Saul didn't act high and mighty. Monroe had once helped him answer many questions, even if those were paid sessions. Saul remained respectful toward those who had helped him in the past. "You're here to see Kanksha." "Yeah, I've got some questions for her. She's been gone from the tower for a long time, long enough that some think she's already dead out there." Saul sighed. He had suspected as much. If Kanksha really went to that so-called Elf Valley Billy mentioned, she might never return. She was also approaching 30, maybe only a year or half a year away. Braving danger to head for Elf Valley might have been her final chance to advance to third rank. With Kanksha gone, Saul had no one to ask about the questions troubling him. He looked up at Monroe and said, "Thank you." He was about to turn and leave, but Monroe stopped him. "Saul, before she left, Concha came looking for you, but you weren't around, so she asked me to give you something in case I ran into you." "What?" "Something for me." Saul was a little surprised. As far as he remembered after their deal over Elven Whispers, they hadn't really interacted, yet she came looking for him before leaving. If it had been before today, Saul might have declined outright. But after today's soul infusion experiment, his curiosity about Concha had only grown. "What is it? Let me see." He didn't reach out. He wasn't necessarily going to accept it. Monroe began digging around inside his clothes. Saul frowned slightly. What kind of item does Monroe carry around like this? Where is it? I was sure I kept it on me." Monroe checked himself all over but couldn't find it. Something like this shouldn't happen to a cautious wizard apprentice. "Maybe I left it in my room. Come in with me and we'll take a look." Monroe raised his head and gestured for Saul to enter his room. Saul took one step toward the doorway, then stopped. Monroe noticed the missing footstep and looked back. "What's wrong?" Saul smiled. "I'll wait out here, Senior." Then he added, "Honestly, I'm not all that eager to receive Concha's gift." Monroe clearly didn't expect that. He stood still for a moment, one eye visible beyond the doorframe. That eye stared straight at Saul for a full 3 seconds. The air turned strange. Saul pressed his fingertips together, calm and unflinching, returning Monroe's gaze silently. Then Monroe moved. He stepped into his room and quickly began rummaging. About 30 seconds later, an excited voice called from inside. "Here it is." Then Saul heard a wet squelching sound. "Got you." He stepped forward quickly and looked into Monroe's room. He saw Monroe lowering his hand from his face, right as their eyes met. Monroe's fingers were wrapped around an eyeball, freshly and violently plucked from his own socket. The lid had been torn open, blood now covering half his face and soaking his collar. Saul raised an eyebrow. If this gift turned out to be a crushed, misshapen eyeball, he certainly wasn't taking it. But Monroe just glanced at the ruined eye and casually tossed it to the floor. Then he raised his hand again. 2 fingers plunged into the bloody, empty socket. With the aid of blood as lubricant, they made another wet, squishy sound as they scraped inside. Then Monroe drew his fingers out. At the tips, apparently, he was pinching something. Apparently, because between those fingers, there was absolutely nothing visible. Monroe extended his hand toward Saul. "Here, come take it." Chapter 349, Long-Term Warning. Monroe's face was streaked with blood, yet he seemed completely numb to it. Saul didn't enter immediately. Instead, he stood at the doorway, watching Monroe hold up his hand, thumb and forefinger close together, as if pinching something invisible. Saul nearly asked, "What are you holding?" But just as he opened his mouth, he swallowed the words back down. Because he saw it, Monroe's fingertips were ever so slightly indented, as if he really were holding something. Saul took a step forward, his foot landing on the doorframe. Even now, the diary offered no hint. "No major danger," Saul muttered, though it wasn't as if the diary's silence gave him any real peace of mind. After these few years as a wizard apprentice, he was no longer the same greenhorn who had needed the diary's help to tell apart white mushrooms from poisonous ones. With his mental sensing and instinct alone, Saul could more or less confirm that whatever was in Monroe's hand wasn't dangerous to him. But it was definitely strange. "Do I really want to take this thing?" Saul thought. "Whether Concha meant it for me or not, it's bound to be a hassle." Even though he was confident he could handle what Monroe was offering, Saul was still weighing whether it was worth accepting. He already had plenty of troublesome things on him, not to mention a mission that might end in 5 years, or any day now. But just as he hesitated, a voice suddenly shrieked in his ear, eager, frenzied. "Ah, Brother Saul, I want it. Brother Saul, I want it, I want it, I want it." A flash of silver light, and Penny appeared, landing on Saul's left shoulder, shouting into his left ear, then hopping to his right shoulder and blasting his other ear with the same magical noise. "Brother Saul, I want that thing, Master. Give it to me, I want it." Saul felt dark lines forming across his face. "Quiet," he barked in his mind. The diary promptly flipped open in response, as if ready to stuff Penny back inside. The crazed, obsessive voice vanished immediately, but the nightmare butterfly didn't give up. It fluttered in front of Saul, tracing a figure eight in the air. By now, Saul had gotten good at ignoring that flickering silver light, even as it hovered in plain view. He stepped forward and entered the room, coming to stand directly before Monroe. Monroe, after finishing his last sentence, stood perfectly still, waiting for Saul. Saul didn't reach out right away. Instead, he asked inwardly, "Penny, what is Monroe holding?" "It's veiled crystal essence," Penny answered. "Just like me, it exists in a liminal state between the physical and the conscious. Master, if you give it to me, I can regain a lot of strength." Veiled crystal essence. Saul had heard the term before, but here, it seemed to be referring to a substance, something as mystical as Penny herself. "Master, you can only store veiled crystal essence using flesh and blood. Any other sealing method you try will likely result in it being lost." "Is that because flesh and blood can make contact with it?" Saul asked inwardly. "Not exactly. Hiss-ha, Penny actually started making drooling sounds. "When you store it in your flesh, your mind automatically recognizes there's something there. Your nerves then relay a discomfort, helping you track it in both body and mind. But if you store it in a box, and you look at the empty box and wonder for even a second if there's anything inside, poof, you'll never find the veiled crystal essence again." Penny's explanation piqued Saul's curiosity. Interesting. No longer hesitating, he extended his hand under Monroe's fingers and slowly moved upward. No longer a rookie in the wizard world, Saul didn't need Penny to remind him. He began mentally whispering to reinforce his perception. "There's a completely transparent object there. My hand is about to touch it. There's a completely transparent object there. My fingers are 5 millimeters away. I should be touching it now." Just as the thought came, Saul's fingertips brushed something. It had no temperature, or perhaps it simply matched the surface temperature of his skin. But he could feel it. He was sure. His fingertip dimpling ever so slightly confirmed the contact. Then he brought his thumb up to meet it. From above and below, he mimicked Monroe's posture, pinching the veiled crystal essence. Once Saul had a firm hold, Monroe finally released it. "You'd best store it somewhere that makes you feel uncomfortable the moment you think about it," Monroe said, pointing to his own eye socket. "That way, even if you forget its existence, your body's subconscious will raise an unpleasant alarm and help you remember." He sounded much more normal now. Indeed, fear comes from the unknown. But when you start operating on the same wavelength as a so-called lunatic wizard, you realize they're the sane ones. You were the ignorant fool stumbling through chaos. "This was something Concha left with me the last time she returned," Monroe explained. "She said that one day you'd come looking for her. When that day came, I was to give this to you." As he spoke, he bent down to pick up the eyeball he'd just thrown away. It was now cloudy and misshapen. He didn't bother brushing off the dust, just stuffed it back into his mouth. Crunch, crunch. Some translucent fluid dribbled from the corners of his lips. She also said, "Crunch, crunch, if you want more. Go find her on the eastern cliff of Hanging Hands Valley." Saul's fingers instinctively tightened around the veiled crystal essence. A faint prickling pain came from his fingertips. Eastern cliff of Hanging Hands Valley. It's the Forest of Seasons. Penny's voice returned now that the silencing was lifted, whispering softly. At least, that's what we call it. The wizarding world usually refers to it as Elven Valley. Elves? Saul's heart skipped a beat. Concha wanted to lure him into Elven Valley. Thanks but no thanks, Saul wanted to say. But just as he made up his mind to walk away, the diary flipped open. On its white pages, black words began to emerge. November 13, year 316 of the lunar calendar. Madness called to you. You turned away. Chaos asked you to dance. You declined. Pain served you a feast. You folded your napkin. Hatred bared herself before you. You closed your eyes. So when life abandons you, do not complain of your powerlessness. A death warning. And based on the language, it wasn't an immediate one. This was like the first fork in a major quest line. A single wrong choice could alter the entire ending. This wasn't the diary's first long-term warning, but it was the first long-term death warning. Saul grew instantly serious. The sensation of the veiled crystal essence in his hand became even more tangible. I understand. Saul stared at Monroe, trying to gauge how much more he knew. I'll go when I need to. Monroe smiled. No rush, the snow's coming. You've got time, go when it melts. Penny added, the Forest of Seasons doesn't have winter, so you won't be able to get in during the snow season. Even with the death warning, Saul didn't panic. He even chuckled a little. Perfect, I hate the cold. Chapter 350, A Busy Snow Season. The region where the Wizard Tower was located was relatively close to the tropics. The snow season came later. However, the snow season in this world, essentially winter, was also unlike that of Saul's original world. Whether it snowed in winter was decided by the local third rank or higher wizards. If such a wizard needed a damp experimental environment, then even in the dead of winter, it would be filled with constant rain and humidity. If he wanted warmth, then even if yesterday had been a snowy wasteland, today flowers could bloom under a sunny sky. And the stronger the wizard, the wider the area they could control. The Western continent, due to a major war a century ago, currently had no third-rank wizards. As a result, the weather there obediently followed the natural rhythm of the four seasons. Snow had fallen intermittently for 3 months before vanishing overnight, as if scraped away with a blade. The end of the snow season came with knife-sharp clarity. On the 4th day of the 4th month, year 317 of the new lunar calendar, Saul welcomed his 3rd birthday at the Wizard Tower. However, the few who even knew his birthday either weren't at the tower or had already died. Naturally, Saul didn't care whether anyone celebrated it. In fact, he himself hadn't even realized the date. That day, he was lying personally on the experimental table in the second storeroom. Hayden, who had regained his skill level, was crouched over, drawing a magic formation on Saul's palms. The formation had been developed by Saul himself, and since Hayden was better at hands-on work than theory, all he could do was trace what he didn't fully understand. Fortunately, the guy had a steady hand and was better at drawing intricate lines than Saul was with one hand. After drawing the final key node, Hayden tried to stand, but his knees gave out from crouching too long, and he collapsed to the floor. You've done well, take a break. All right. Hayden, who had been struggling to get up, simply flopped back down onto the floor. He spread out his arms and legs, trying to relax his numb limbs. Although his outer form was now completely female, inside he still had the temperament of a man, no sense of modesty whatsoever. Saul climbed down from the table, stepped over Hayden's splayed legs, and went to the experiment table to continue refining the formation on his hands. Though Hayden had achieved the strength of a second-rank apprentice, his mental strength hadn't caught up, so Saul didn't let him inscribe the full formation. Without full understanding, Hayden wouldn't be able to complete the core section. Even if he copied it perfectly, it wouldn't work. The snow season, over. If I don't set out soon, that diary will probably start pestering me to move. In fact, due to the diary's long-range death warnings, Saul had originally planned to go to the Elven Valley on the very first day the snow season ended. But when he was about to set out, the diary cryptically hinted that he wasn't ready yet. If he wasn't ready, it meant he might die in the Elven Valley, or miss out on something crucial. Yet the diary refused to say exactly what he lacked. After numerous mental simulations and analyzing the situation on his own, Saul finally got the diary to change its hint and offer a solution. He then spent another 2 months refining his plan. That plan involved the 2 magic formations on his palms. These were the result of Saul's sleepless efforts and enormous mental effort, an upgraded version of the mental realm formation. Yes, he had taken a formation that originally required a 4 square meter floor to draw and shrunk it down to fit inside his palms. Moreover, he had split it in 2 and fixed each half separately. Now, whenever he needed to activate the formation, he simply pressed his palms together in a cross pattern, as if clapping, to complete the full circuit. Then, with help from Penny the Nightmare Butterfly, he could purge distracting thoughts and instantly enter the mental realm. Within the platform, Saul had greater control over his mental power and soul body. The diary also took on a physical form there, making it far easier to manipulate. Most elven artifacts had the ability to disrupt one's soul body. Without the protection of the soul body, a person's consciousness could be polluted by elven temptations, leading to madness or death. But Saul's mental realm was a special battlefield that stripped away physical strength disparities. Inside, the diary's power could be utilized to its fullest extent. Within the platform, Saul's soul body was exceptionally stable, able to shapeshift freely without risking cognitive distortion. Additionally, the 4 other soul entities could also take on physical form in the platform, no longer just theoretical advisors. This was most likely the preparation the diary had required Saul to complete in order to deal with the rumoredly bizarre elven relics. Even though the formation is fully designed and the diary hasn't given another warning, I still need to run some practical tests, Saul said as he glanced around. Through the gaps in the storage racks, he could see the corpses standing with their backs to him. These guys seem calm, but the moment my soul body shifts even a little, they'll come at me, more sensitive than a hound's nose. After a long while, Saul completed the final key point of the formation. He slowly stood, waiting for the magical energy flowing across it to stabilize. Next, the formation would need to be soaked in a potion to lock it in and reduce metabolic loss. "Hayden, if you're done resting, get over here and mix the potion," Saul called out. Though Hayden had spent 6 months as a test subject and regained the skills he'd honed in the corpse chamber, his long-dormant laziness had begun to resurface. He often lacked initiative, needing Saul to give explicit orders to get moving. This left Saul a little disappointed. Sometimes, he even wished Hayden's second personality would emerge to help with the experiments. After all, that personality was proactive in every aspect. Saul had no plans to accept it fully, but when it came to lab work, it really was amazing. Just as Hayden was about to fall asleep on the floor, he scrambled to his feet and rushed to prepare the potion. This potion was crucial. It determined how long the formations on Saul's palms could last. Unlike finished potions, most wizard concoctions had to be mixed on the spot to ensure maximum effectiveness. Herman wasn't in the storeroom at the moment. To be precise, he had returned to the diary, because Saul had wrecked his body for the nth time. This was mainly due to Saul's wild ideas and experiments that paid no mind to damage or cost. Over the decades, the number of corpses in the second storeroom had decreased rather than increased. When Tower Master Gorsa heard about this, he didn't care. In fact, he considered it a normal sign of experimental progress. Over the past 6 months, Saul had also noticed that the atmosphere in the Wizard Tower had become increasingly tense, especially on Mentor Rum's side, where the resurrection experiment seemed to have made a breakthrough. Nearly every mentor and apprentice in the tower had been mobilized to assist with Rum's experiments. Under Rum's strict, almost harsh standards, over 100 wizard apprentices were operating like tightly meshed gears, spinning at high speed. In contrast, Saul, once the Tower Master's greatest hope, had holed himself up in the corpse chamber for half a year without making a peep. Aside from Hayden, he hadn't requested any materials, prompting gossip among the other apprentices. Saul, however, paid them no mind, continuing his experiments methodically and finding time to strengthen himself in the cracks. As he finished brewing the potion and was wiping his hands with a cloth, the message pen on the table suddenly activated. Could it be a task from the mentor? Saul clicked his tongue. He hadn't received a mission in nearly 2 months. Though Mentor Rum was leading a grand experiment, they hadn't needed any materials from the second storeroom. So even though Saul wasn't kept in the dark about the project's content, he only had a vague idea of what Rum was trying to achieve. It was too complicated. Even if someone handed him the full formula, it would take Saul half a month to decipher it. All he was certain of was that Rum's research direction was completely different from his own. It was focused on transforming souls. So when the message pen suddenly activated, Saul was a little surprised. But when he looked over at the parchment with mild curiosity, he found only 2 large characters written on it. Come out. Chapter 351. You call this a birthday present. The familiar handwriting. The familiar tone. Kelly, has she finished her research on radioactive toxins and returned? Saul smiled, then sucked in a sharp breath between his teeth. Hiss, it's been 3 months since I last contacted her. Saul turned to look at Hayden, who was carefully standing still after preparing the potion. You, forget it. Pack up the experimental materials, then continue resting. Saul originally planned to have Hayden organize the experimental notes, but fearing that this guy might overlook some subtle yet crucial experimental details, he decided to handle it himself. After assigning the task to Hayden, he quickly turned and strode toward the bronze door. As soon as he opened the door, he saw Kelly, who took a half step back. Why did you suddenly open the door? Kelly stared with lifeless eyes at Saul. You've grown taller. About 10 centimeters, Saul smirked. Kelly was the only one who immediately noticed his change in height. Of course, this might also be because she now had to look up at Saul. Actually, I've been growing ever since I completed the second body transformation. It's just become more noticeable recently. Saul didn't hold back and gestured to Kelly's head, revealing that she used to be slightly shorter than him, but now only reached his nose. Kelly rolled her eyes in response. Saul also observed Kelly's changes. Ever since advancing to second-rank apprentice, they had seen each other less frequently. Every time they met, both had undergone significant changes. Now, Kelly's transformation was also quite striking. Her long red hair had completely turned golden. Not the usual golden hair with blue eyes, but a gold similar to high-purity brass, almost like pure gold coins. She no longer braided her hair for convenience, but let it fall freely. The ends of her hair had become harder, almost as if each strand of hair had a steel needle attached to it. The metallic gleam on her skin had completely faded. Saul didn't know if she had hidden it or if it had shifted to her hair. You've finished your research on radioactive toxins. Of course, Kelly looked at Saul with a "did you really have to ask" expression. Well, congratulations on finally being able to return to the tower. Saul's congratulations weren't very heartfelt. Compared to the increasingly mysterious Wizard Tower, Saul preferred Kelly to return to the Black Castle to research on her own. She was the type of person who focused entirely on experiments and rarely participated in any gatherings, only occasionally discussing knowledge or necessary material collection with Saul. Thus, Kelly's progress was evident. Saul could sense the strong presence of metal-elemental particles around her. She was probably not far from third rank. However, when Kelly heard Saul's congratulations, she averted her eyes, glancing to the left. That's not quite it. I still have some finishing work left. Saul was taken aback. Did you run into some difficulties? He had thought that Kelly came to the tower to ask him or someone else for help. Idiot! Kelly was speechless. She suddenly pulled something out of her pocket and held it up in front of Saul's eyes. Today's your birthday. As usual, I'm here to give you a gift. Saul's body stiffened. He ignored the swaying item that looked like a necklace and focused on Kelly. I completely forgot. Kelly, don't tell me you like me. As soon as he asked, Saul regretted it. The question was so direct, like something an inexperienced kid would ask. It wasn't something a grown man like him should be asking. Kelly's mouth twitched. She flipped the necklace and thwacked it on Saul's head. You must have lost your mind. She shook the necklace again, signaling Saul to hurry up and take it. Saul felt awkward but quickly grabbed the necklace, looking down at it to quickly shift his attention. The chain of the necklace was made of fine silver links, and the pendant was a transparent glass ball about the size of a thumb. The glass ball had an intricate magical pattern carved into its surface, and Saul immediately recognized it as a type of sealing magic formation. After Kelly's special modification, he couldn't immediately tell which kind of external force it was designed to seal. Inside the glass ball, there was a silver-white metal-like substance. Its surface was uneven, and it took on an irregular cubic shape. As Saul held the pendant up to his eyes, he vaguely felt that the metal-like substance was emitting a faint dark blue glow. What is this? A magical item you made? This is the radioactive toxin I just developed. I'm giving you the first piece, Kelly replied, folding her arms and proudly raising her eyebrows. Oh, Saul was still very interested in Kelly's radioactive toxin. He hadn't expected her to really create it and even give him the first piece. It looks very impressive based on its external characteristics. Does it have an antidote? I'd like to study it too. I'm still working on the antidote. Kelly said it so confidently, without a hint of hesitation. This time, it was Saul who twitched his lips. So the finishing work you're doing is developing the antidote. Kelly didn't deny it, her eyes wandering to the side. By the way, be careful when you store it. The toxicity is still pretty strong. I can tell, you've given me a bomb. Saul actually wanted to ask, you call this a birthday present? But he didn't dare. He knew he'd just get a wide-eyed response from Kelly. By the way, I haven't named this toxin yet. Since the inspiration came from your suggestion, you can name it, Kelly shrugged. Saul turned the pendant in his palm once. Right now, he wasn't interested in studying the radioactive toxin inside. He wanted to first check how secure the external seal was. You want me to name it? Saul's mind briefly flashed through some familiar knowledge. How about Alpha? Ah, Alpha. Why would you name it something so hard to pronounce? Kelly corrected her tongue and repeated the name in full. Oh, it is a bit. Well then. Saul was about to suggest another name when Kelly quickly interrupted him. Forget it, Alpha it is. That's its name now. Seeing Saul cautiously put the necklace away, Kelly smiled. All right, I actually came back to ask Master Guido something, and I wanted to check on you. Now I'm leaving. Without saying goodbye, Kelly turned and ran, her hair fanning out in the air. Halfway through, she suddenly stopped, turned her head and seriously told Saul, Remember to get me a birthday gift and don't make it too cheap." With that, she didn't wait for Saul's response and quickly ran into the dark corridor. That girl, Saul didn't even know what to complain about. However, before he could turn and head back into the bronze door, another faint sound of footsteps echoed from the dark corridor. It was Kelly's footsteps. Saul immediately turned around, his eyes turning icy cold. "Who's there?" The voice came from the middle of the corridor. Someone had been quietly lurking in the darkness while Saul and Kelly were talking, and neither of them had noticed. The person slowly emerged from the mist-like darkness, stepping into the candlelight, revealing their true identity. Saul's eyes shifted from cold to puzzled. Byron hesitated, unsure where to look. His throat, where his mouth should be, opened and closed awkwardly. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop." Chapter 352, Smash It. Senior Byron has grown stronger again. The moment Saul saw that the eavesdropper was Byron, the wariness and anger in his heart dissipated more than halfway. At the same time, he couldn't help but marvel at how Byron was getting closer and closer to becoming a true wizard. Kelly had just walked past him moments ago and hadn't sensed anything at all. And judging from the fact that Byron could now speak freely, it seemed he was on the verge of solving the problem of mentalizing the locator. He no longer needed the pressure from wraiths to push himself forward. Maybe in another 2 months, the Wizard Tower would gain a new true wizard. Saul was genuinely happy for Byron. Do people in your hometown celebrate birthdays and give gifts? Somehow, Senior Byron managed to make the act of receiving gifts sound like a forced obligation. "It's just a childhood habit. Kelly and I only give each other gifts for fun, to make a little fuss over it." Byron nodded, then pulled a thread-bound notebook from his cloak and held it out to Saul. "A birthday gift for you." Saul froze for a moment. Before he could ask anything, Byron lowered his head. "Fine, not a birthday gift. It's actually my research notes on the gray matter. Consider it repayment for the study credits I owed you. I value this notebook at 300 credits, so now you owe me 17. Byron paused, then added, "Let's just call those 17 credits your birthday gift." Saul shook his head and sighed. A senior will always be a senior. He didn't stand on ceremony with Byron. Taking the notebook, clearly organized with great care, he flipped through it casually. Gray matter. That was the mysterious substance he and Byron had discovered on the seafloor of Bluewater Bay. It emitted a strange, magical wave. At the time, Byron had suspected that the stone's energy was what had caused changes in the soul fragments, drawing them together to form the soul tide. After that, the two of them each collected a portion to bring back for research. But because Saul had been focusing on absorbing soul fragments and was already burdened with research and study tasks, he had shelved the gray matter, just like he had done with the nightmare butterflies. He hadn't expected that half a year later, Byron would hand over his findings directly. "Senior, is your current progress thanks to the gray matter?" If it were something ordinary, Byron wouldn't have valued it at 300 study credits or gone out of his way to deliver it. Saul hadn't expected that the unexpected find would turn out to be the key to Byron's advancement. He quickly found the key section of the notes. The gray matter could simultaneously increase both the soul body's and the physical body's capacity for dark element particles, while also shielding the user from intrusive thoughts to some extent. Byron had refined the gray matter into a potion. At the end of the notes, Byron had written, "This potion can moderately enhance the drinker's mental power, which may aid in becoming a true wizard." Seeing Saul flip to the last page so quickly, Byron added an explanation. "My mental strength has already reached the standard for a true wizard. My magic has long surpassed the threshold. Only the mentalization of the locator is missing the final step, probably in another 6 months to a year." Byron didn't finish his sentence. He had never been one to boast before doing something, so even though he was already confident he could become a true wizard, he swallowed the rest of his words. But Saul understood perfectly, and once again felt genuinely happy for Senior Byron. Take your time reading it. If you have any questions, come find me in the dormitory. I won't be going out again before my advancement. All right, Saul nodded with a smile. After all these years, it was rare to have a third-rank apprentice so close to becoming a true wizard. No doubt the Tower Master and Mentor Kaz would begin to pay closer attention to Senior Byron as well. With business concluded, Byron left. Saul was in high spirits, still flipping through the notebook as he walked back to the second storage room. I always suspected the gray matter wasn't ordinary, just didn't have the time to research it. I can't believe Senior Byron discovered so much. If Saul wanted to make use of the gray matter, he could actually rely on the diary's preemptive warning trait to recreate the potion without knowing its composition or mechanism, much like Byron had. But ever since becoming a third-rank apprentice, Saul had warned himself again and again, unless absolutely necessary, he must never again rely on the diary to make potions or construct formations. Otherwise, with his shaky fundamentals and constant guesswork, he'd be ruined sooner or later. Still, the notes showed that, although Byron had figured out the properties and uses of the gray matter, he hadn't yet uncovered its origin. That, of course, was the hardest part. But Saul speculated it definitely involved a massive amount of death. What he hadn't told Byron was that his own mental strength had long since exceeded the standard for a true wizard, perhaps even more so. It was just that his magic still fell a bit short. And the locator problem that plagued most third-rank apprentices, he had solved that even before breaking through to third rank. At his current pace, barring any accidents, he too could meet the minimum requirement for becoming a true wizard in another 6 months or so. Much of this progress he owed to the waters of Bluewater Bay. During the snowy winter, he had made 2 more trips there to collect soul fragments. Both times, he had entered that strange state surrounded by chaotic thoughts and glimpsed the fine thread that connected all things. Unfortunately, the diary had filtered out all the thoughts before he could touch the thread, pulling him back from the brink of mental contamination. Still, those 2 intrusions had further strengthened both his magic and mental power. They drastically shortened the time he needed to accumulate progress toward becoming a true wizard. The only thing that left Saul puzzled, or perhaps regretful, was that on those 2 trips he hadn't encountered another soul tide. When he asked around, he learned that Bluewater Bay hadn't seen a soul tide in over half a year. Starting from 1 month before his first visit, the area had returned to a peace it hadn't known in a century. But for the locals, that was undoubtedly a blessing. On his second visit to Bluewater Bay, he once again saw the boy Bamboo collecting shells. It seemed Bamboo's life had improved thanks to the soul tide's disappearance. His clothes and shoes were noticeably cleaner and sturdier than the first time Saul had seen him. Saul merely watched the hardworking boy from afar. He didn't approach to greet him. After all, they were not people from the same world. In the end, Saul silently turned and left. After that second departure from Bluewater Bay, he never returned. Most of the glowing soul fragments had already been absorbed by him. That place had lost its final appeal. The recollection ended as Saul, still holding the notebook, arrived at the second storage room. Senior Byron refined the gray matter into a potion, which apparently boosted his mental power quite a bit. In a few days, I'll be going to the Elven Valley. I could try making this potion myself. If I can raise my mental power just a little more, all the better. Though Saul's mental strength already exceeded most true wizards, who would complain about getting even stronger. This birthday had turned out surprisingly joyful. In this terrifying world of wizards, in the pressure cooker of a wizard tower where lives were gambled daily, he had actually met two pure-hearted people, two sincere friends. It was truly unbelievable. Saul held the notebook in his left hand and the alpha necklace in his right. He even childishly looped the chain around his finger and spun it. But after 2 twirls, he hooked his finger and gripped it tightly again. This isn't an ordinary necklace. The pendant's glass, and if it breaks, that wouldn't be good. He had no intention of being the one to test Kelly's creation. But the next moment, Saul suddenly stopped in his tracks. His right hand ring finger gently rotated the glass orb in his palm. Smash it! His steps slowed as he pushed open the storage room door with his elbow. As soon as he entered, he saw Nick at the front of the corpse group. From within Nick's body, waves of mental suggestion were still radiating outward. Smash it, smash it, smash it. Chapter 353, Sweet Dreams. Hayden, that's enough work for today. You can go bah. Saul's words came to an abrupt halt the moment he saw Hayden. Hayden was sitting on the ground, her back slumped weakly against the wall. She struggled to lift her head and forced a smile at Saul. Sir, I don't think I can move anymore. Both of Hayden's eyes had fallen out. One lay on her robe, the other had rolled under the nearby lab table. The culprit was the white, prismatic crystal protruding from her eye sockets. Saul immediately stowed away his notebook and the alpha necklace into his compression satchel, then hurried to her side. He carefully examined Hayden's head and found crystalline formations not only where her eyes had been, but also near her ears and on both sides of her neck. They jutted out like bony spikes from beneath her skin, yet there were no wounds or bleeding. It seemed that the synthetic blood inside her body crystallized the moment it tried to flow out, becoming part of the formations. As a subject of the soul infusion experiment, Hayden was supposed to undergo routine checkups every 6 months. But since the project had been terminated early, her last checkup was brought forward. Nearly half a year had passed, and her body was already showing signs of collapse. Saul could try mimicking Mentor Kaz's technique to purge the rust from Hayden's body, but judging by her current state, the problem likely lay in her brain. That was Mentor Rum's area of expertise. Saul didn't know how to deal with it, not even in theory. Sir, am I done for? Hayden's voice trembled. Her occasionally visible tongue was already speckled with crystals. Even the pale skin visible at her collar was studded with similar formations. Her limbs, being farther from her head, still appeared normal. But when Saul pressed his fingers into her muscles, they felt rigid and oddly solid. He could tell that it wouldn't be long before her entire body was pierced through by crystals. The soul infusion experiment had ended, and Hayden's body couldn't even hold out for a full year. Saul seriously doubted that even those who underwent regular maintenance could last more than 2 or 3 years at most. He gently laid Hayden's body down on the floor, then ran a finger along her back. The fabric of her clothes split open instantly, falling away to reveal her bare back and the golden formation etched there. The formation itself showed no errors, but within its shifting patterns, a face twisted in agony became faintly visible. It was clear the formation had severed her ability to feel her body. Otherwise, she'd be writhing in pain on the ground, not lying there like a dead fish. At least the formation isn't malfunctioning, Saul muttered with a hint of relief. Hayden, your body was constructed from a modified second-rank apprentice corpse. Now the internal fillings have undergone an irreversible reaction. I can temporarily purge these crystals to help you regain basic movement, but that would only be a temporary fix. Saul turned Hayden over and found that a white crystalline layer had formed on her lips as well. Besides, I don't yet have the ability to fully restore your original state, but there is another option. He paused for a few seconds to let Hayden digest the information. When he saw her slowly purse her lips, he continued, "I will seal you in a solution. This solution will dissolve the crystals on your body, but it will also dissolve the internal fillings, leaving you paralyzed for a time. During this period, I'll try to repair the damage to your soul body as best I can. Afterward, I'll find you a new body. But until then, you'll be in a state where you can think but not move. To keep you from going insane, I'll seal your consciousness as well, turn everything into a dream. But whether you wake from that dream is not guaranteed. This is all just untested theory. So, are you willing to take that risk?" Hayden slowly opened her mouth. Her entire oral cavity was already filled with crystal, more like a glittering cavern than a human mouth. "I'm willing." Her voice was slurred, but the tone was resolute. Saul froze. He heard two voices in that response, one belonging to Hayden, the other to her second persona. Even at the edge of life and death, they'd made the exact same choice without hesitation. Saul nodded with satisfaction. "Then I'll begin." He stood and started preparing the solution. Most of the ingredients were already on hand. He just needed to mix them. As for the container, he used the stone coffin. It was large enough and had excellent sealing properties. While preparing the solution, Saul took a knife and a saw to the large crystal formations on Hayden's body, removing them one by one. He couldn't use magic. It might trigger a mutative reaction. As the harsh grinding sounds echoed through the lab, his mind drifted to the necklace tucked against his chest. He shook his head and chuckled softly. Just moments earlier, while facing Nick's corpse and hearing that repeated whisper, "Smash it," Saul had almost begun to suspect Kelly. Her father was the Duke of Highland, the highest-ranking noble in the Kemiduchi. The wizard apprentice who had delivered the slender wraith to Saul was also someone only high nobles could access, a court magic. The letter from Kismet had been passed down via Kelly's brother, through Kelly, and then to Saul. Then there was today's toxic and fragile birthday gift. It was hard not to make a string of suspicious connections, and even begin to question a 3-year-long friendship. But Hayden's sudden emergency had shattered that spiral of doubt. The shift in focus brought him back to calm. And with calm came clarity. At the very least, back when Kelly had first extended a helping hand, no one other than the Tower Master knew about his aptitude. Even without the diary's guidance this time, Saul chose to trust his own judgment, his own instincts. But this incident had served as a reminder. After finishing his preparations, Saul clapped the dust from his hands, then gently lifted the now clean, slippery body of Hayden and lowered her into the solution, which had already begun to react violently with sorcery. Throughout it all, Hayden clenched her teeth tight. No matter how painful the crystal extractions or the corrosive burning of the solution, she didn't utter a single cry. As the liquid rose and submerged her face, Hayden forced her head to turn toward Saul. She stared at him with empty sockets where her eyes had once been. Saul leaned down close. Though his arms were submerged in the solution, and though Hayden likely couldn't see anything anymore, he still smiled gently and said, "Sleep well, sweet dreams." The viscous, stinging liquid sealed her senses. Darkness fell and pain faded in an instant. A faint shimmer of light emerged. A silver butterfly fluttered past, parting the endless veil of black. Sunlight streamed down, warming Hayden's eyelids. She opened her eyes and instinctively raised a hand to block the sun. Bright light passed through her fingers, turning her palm a soft, translucent orange red. She pushed herself up and found she was lying on the grass in the garden of her home. "Hayden," her father stormed over, furious, a riding crop in hand. "If you keep slacking off on your common language studies, I won't enroll you when the Wizard Tower comes to recruit next year." "Then don't," Hayden burst out laughing, laying back down with his hands behind his head. The soft grass cradled his body. Chapter 354, Saul's Resurrection Plan. Watching Hayden completely sink into the solution, Saul withdrew his hand and shook off the liquid on it with an expressionless face. The corrosive solution had reddened his arm, but once he was done shaking it off and rolled his sleeve back down, the skin on his arm had already fully healed. "Brother Saul, he's already fallen asleep." A silver butterfly suddenly rose from beneath the surface of the liquid. The corrosive solution had no effect on it whatsoever. "All right." Saul nodded, pulled out a sheet of paper, and recorded the time and Hayden's condition. Then, imitating the procedure used in the circular laboratory on the 20th floor, he stuck the record sheet onto the side of the stone coffin. After that, he turned and walked toward the lab table, the butterfly fluttering behind him. The silver butterfly had grown a size larger than it had been 6 months ago. Not only that, its ability to create dreams had also significantly improved. Originally, Nightmare Butterfly Penny had only been able to use a fraction of her power due to being bound by the diary. But ever since Saul gave her a bit of the hidden crystal left behind specifically by Kongsha, Penny had grown larger, and the patterns on her body had become more intricate. Hidden crystals could accelerate the growth of young nightmare butterflies. That tiny bit of hidden crystal had saved Penny approximately 3 years of natural development. No wonder she went completely wild the moment she saw it. But in truth, Saul gave Penny the hidden crystal as a way to test the material properties of the crystal. The remaining hidden crystal, naturally, was kept for Saul's own research. This kind of substance was very difficult to preserve. It had to be stored within living flesh with perception. But Saul had no intention of being like Monroe, who put it in his eye. In the end, he chose to bury the hidden crystal beneath the skin of his wrist, nestled against bone and meridians. That way, with every heartbeat, he could feel the sting it caused, constantly reminding him of the crystal's presence. Moreover, Saul's second modification of his skin made it especially sensitive to a substance like the hidden crystal, which existed somewhere between consciousness and matter. "How long can your dream last?" Saul asked Penny as he sat down at the long table. "It's just the soul of a first-rank apprentice. It'll last until he dies. Even then, the dream can continue until the soul completely fades away." Penny replied disdainfully. But recalling who she was talking to, she quickly added in a slightly fawning tone, "Though, I thought Brother Saul would have stored his consciousness in the diary. Brother Saul is so amazing after all." She still wanted another piece of hidden crystal and would stop at nothing to get it. After Saul forbade her from directly asking for it, she began rotating through flattery, pouting, and playing the victim. Unfortunately for her, Saul wasn't swayed by any of it. Hayden isn't suited to stay inside the diary. At the moment, Saul only had one slot left for a black diary page. Until his strength improved enough to support 6 black pages, he wouldn't casually assign the final slot, just in case. Besides, he had other ways to preserve Hayden's consciousness. Why bother putting him into the diary? After researching soul infusion for more than half a year, Saul had gained plenty. Using the infused soul samples as a baseline, he developed improved versions, and combining that with the storage of corpses practically in bulk in the warehouse, he had created multiple kinds of containers suitable for hosting soul bodies. He also found ways to reduce rejection response intensity, or delay the onset of rejection altogether. The most successful of his method could already delay the container's rejection response by 6 months. Though 6 months couldn't compare to the 2 or 3 years soul infusion could maintain, soul infusion relied on a golden formation to forcibly lock the soul into the body, and used the severing of emotional perception to suppress the chaos caused by rejection. In other words, Mentor Rum hadn't truly solved the rejection problem. He had just used two different ways of avoidance to forcibly mash together an incompatible soul and body. That the resulting body could hold together for 2 to 3 years was already impressive. In contrast, Saul's approach was far more sustainable. In his solution, the soul didn't have to endure the unperceivable pain of suppression. As a result, the rate of soul degradation and risk of mutation were significantly reduced. Saul's next goal was to greatly extend the time before rejection occurred, and in the process of extending that period, find a way to completely eliminate rejection altogether. If he could truly discover such an ideal solution, then not only Lady Yura, but also other soul bodies with intact awareness and no contamination could potentially be revived in bulk using this method. Of course, this ideal solution was currently just a theory. Whether it could actually be achieved or how long it would take was still unknown. But Saul's plan to revive Lady Yura didn't depend on reaching that perfect solution. That kind of ability sounded like something out of a goddess of life's divine gift, more likely to appear in a bard's tale. His goal was simply to delay the rejection response for 10 years. Saul believed that if he could extend the rejection window to over 10 years, he could essentially revive Lady Yura in another way. After reading through the experimental notes provided by Master Gorsa, Saul discovered a critical issue. The reason Lady Yura deteriorated so rapidly after soul separation was that the vessel she had chosen wasn't capable of protecting her soul like her original body had. On the contrary, it aggravated rejection, accelerating contamination. The body is the soul's original sanctuary, but it must be the original body. Lady Yura likely didn't realize this harsh truth until she had already separated her soul and remained in an artificial vessel for a long time. Previously, she had only temporarily left her body and resided in a fresh vessel, so she mistakenly believed she could freely switch bodies and thereby gain soul independence. She didn't expect that long-term residence in a foreign body would amplify soul contamination through rejection, and that transferring out of a vessel would cause secondary contamination. Even a true wizard's soul wasn't strong enough to resist that level of pollution. So even with Gorsa continually cleansing her soul body and removing contamination, Lady Yura inevitably fell into the abyss of mutation. It's said that after several failed attempts, the Tower Master sealed Lady Yura's soul, forbidding her from any further experiments. And Gorsa himself turned from light to dark, beginning to study resurrection, a topic typically reserved for third-rank wizards. Third-rank wizards researched resurrection. Fourth-rank wizards could already achieve limited resurrection. Resurrection was never meant to be the domain of first- or second-rank wizards. But whether it was Lady Yura or the Tower Master Gorsa, both of them were proud and refused to accept the limitations of their current power. Yet in the end, both paid a heavy price for their ambition. Which is exactly why Saul never intended to actually resurrect anyone from the start. He wasn't about to lend out his diary, either. So he chose a solution that tackled the root cause, without relying on unrealistic fixes. His plan was simple. If he could delay rejection for 10 years, then the soul would remain uncontaminated during its stay in the body. When that 10-year term ended and the soul transferred into a new body, any slight contamination from the transition could be slowly repaired over the next decade, thus forming a cycle, a closed loop. A form of revival in another sense. This experimental concept hadn't been shared with Gorsa yet, because the final validation step still hadn't been performed. And that final step would have to wait until Saul returned from the Elven Valley. After organizing today's experiment logs, Saul once again pulled out the alpha necklace Kelly had given him. Even though I don't think Kelly would become an enemy, this necklace could still be used by others, just like Nick's corpse was. Might as well study it in advance, see if I can create an antidote. Worst case scenario, I piss off Kelly and get a pair of eye rolls in return. Chapter 355, Strength in Numbers. The Elven Valley, also known as the Forest of Seasons. When Saul learned of its location, he couldn't help but feel it was quite the coincidence. The entrance to the Elven Valley was actually near Hanging Hands Valley, separated only by a steep cliff. If Saul and Byron had climbed the other side of that cliff back then, they would have arrived at the Elven Valley. Of course, without the key to enter, they would have been left wandering around the outskirts. Not many people wanted to approach elves anyway. That's why the key to enter the Elven Valley ended up being sold by a third-rank apprentice to a second-rank one. And the one who bought the key, Kongsha, was already considered as good as dead by most people at the time. Saul hadn't been optimistic about Kongsha either. After hearing Gorsa's descriptions of elves, Saul had made a habit of staying far away from anything related to them. If not for the diary issuing a long-term death warning, he would have just let Monroe swallow his other eyeball too. Of course, Monroe wasn't doing so well these days either. Though Saul hadn't deliberately asked around, he knew that shortly after that day, Monroe had stopped showing up to the basic knowledge of all things class. That cushy teaching job had been taken over by another well-read second-rank apprentice. The spacious carriage rolled from flat land onto a scarcely traveled trail. Thanks to a cushioning formation etched into it, the ride was still smooth, and those inside barely felt any bumps. Yes, those inside. This time, Saul had requested a two-horse carriage. It was large enough to comfortably seat 6 people. Aside from himself, 3 emotionless men and women with black veils over their eyes sat inside. The coachman wasn't the usual mushroom driver. Saul really feared the mushroom would end up planting him in the Elven Valley, but rather another veiled, expressionless figure. These 4 were actually corpses Saul had taken from the second storeroom. Gorsa had said before, no one was to take anything out of the storerooms without permission, but Saul had filed a report and easily walked away with 5 corpses. 4 of them were now housing the soul bodies of Herman, Morden, Agu, and En. The last one was a spare. Just in case he ruined another vessel again, he'd have a backup ready. Thanks to Herman's courageous spirit of sacrifice, Saul had fully mastered the technique of infusing soul bodies into vessels. Now, the only challenge left was how to delay rejection. So before setting out for the dangerous Elven Valley, the first thing Saul did after leaving the tower was head to the lakeside cabin and retrieve all 4 soul bodies, placing them into physical vessels. Now including the driver, Saul had 2 men and 2 women with him, perfectly balanced. This was because, aside from Herman, the others didn't need to switch genders. This was another of Saul's discoveries. He found that soul bodies who had once held true wizard power could resist the rejection of same-sex corpses and remain in vessels matching their own gender identity. Only Herman, after trying once, quietly entered the body of a true wizard-level female corpse. In truth, the others could have used vessels of the opposite gender too. For someone at the true wizard level, a small cognitive mismatch wasn't much of a challenge. This was something previous soul infusion researchers probably hadn't known, because they never had access to true wizard soul bodies willing to enter low-level apprentice vessels. The mentors might have known, but they lacked the means to experiment. Same principle. The carriage suddenly jolted, dipped downward, and then began to ascend again. And turned her head and pushed open the window. Branches stretched in from outside, almost poking through the opening. "Master, the woods are getting denser. Should I activate the protective shield?" En's voice was cheerful, sharply contrasting with her stiff expression. "Do it." Saul was still holding the notes Senior Byron had given him. He'd brought a lot with him on this trip. On his wrist was a faint scar. That was Stitch, a curse Saul had cultivated himself. Beneath his cloak was a doll with red eyes clipped in place. In the cage beside his seat were two half-dead little mice. These were his test subjects for experimenting with the toxin Kelly had made. Originally, he'd prepared more than a dozen mice, but they'd been used up too quickly. Now only two barely surviving ones were left, and clearly wouldn't last much longer. Saul figured they'd be dead before they even reached the Elven Valley. No denying Kelly's metal-based toxin was potent. Saul could only try developing an antidote using knowledge from his past life. Though he'd made some progress, he'd given up hope of completing an antidote during this trip. So now his attention returned to the notes Byron had given him on gray matter research. At that moment, Agu leaned forward slightly. "Master, are you planning to craft a potion to enhance mental strength?" Saul looked up from the book. Aside from Herman, the other three soul bodies had adapted quickly to their new vessels. At the very least, none of them still mistakenly called him Pig when they spoke. "That's right. You've all seen Byron's notes. Though the components of gray matter haven't been fully analyzed yet, this potion does significantly enhance mental strength and sensitivity to dark element particles. And so far, no uncontrollable side effects have been observed." When Saul prepared to craft and consume the potion, the diary hadn't warned of any danger. While Saul no longer used the diary to blindly cobble together items or concoctions, he still relied on its danger alerts as a safety net. The wizarding world was a dangerous place, after all. Agu nodded in agreement, but then offered a caution. "Master, even if this potion seems safe, now might not be the best time. You're heading into elf territory. If your mental power increases too abruptly, uncontrolled mental radiation could attract unwanted trouble before you learn to contain it." Saul immediately saw the logic in Agu's words and gave up on crafting the gray matter potion inside the carriage. In the realm of mental force, Morden and Anne were both less capable than Agu and even less informed than Saul, so for now they simply listened quietly. Even Herman, driving outside, was working hard to prove his usefulness, just like the others. "Then you all give it some thought. Before entering the Elven Valley, what other spells should I prepare?" Over the past 6 months, Saul had allotted plenty of time for spell learning and practice, and since he couldn't work on the other two tasks now, he figured he might as well focus on that. The three soul bodies inside the carriage immediately sat up straighter when they saw Saul pull out his spell notebook. If he was going to study spells, they each had their areas of expertise. This was their chance to be of real help. So in the days that followed, Saul spent his time meditating and studying spells. The carriage, occasionally circled by butterflies, raced through the forest. Following the planned route, it sometimes emerged from the trees to travel along a deserted dirt path, and at other times bumped along cliff edges, sending pebbles tumbling down into the abyss below. Eventually, it circled around the barren entrance to Hanging Hands Valley and arrived at the highland on the other side. Though the cliffside still looked barren and devoid of plant life, just a few meters west, the vegetation suddenly became lush and vibrant. Even the carriage's protective shield couldn't penetrate further. Saul and the others disembarked. From here on, they'd have to go on foot. Little Algae guarded the carriage. A black tentacle extended from the back of Saul's neck, split in two. A thin strand dropped beside the carriage, immediately transforming into black soil and sinking underground. The other tip flicked its tongue at a leaping nightmare butterfly before retracting again. Having more people around really made things easier. There was someone for every task. Herman and Morden walked at the front, clearing a path for Saul. Though they had once been powerful wizards and apprentices, as vessels, their capacity to store magic was limited. To conserve magic crystals, they were using brute strength to push through. The vessels surrounding Saul weren't exactly nimble either. Soon enough, their faces and bodies were covered in scratches from branches. Not that pain bothered them, of course. Just then Herman, leading at the front, suddenly let out a low cry. "Who's there?" Everyone turned sharply toward the sound. Beneath the dense canopy and heavy shadows, it looked like a figure was standing just barely visible among the trees. Chapter 356, Entering the Valley. Morden raised a hand to stop Herman, who was about to step forward to investigate. He walked slowly toward the spot where the shadow had appeared. The dirt and gravel on the ground began to jump and quiver, as though some invisible force was drawing them in. Saul looked down and swept his gaze across the area. This was his first time witnessing Morden casting a spell. Though Morden had once been tainted, and his body now held only limited magical power, he remained the strongest in pure combat ability among the four consciousnesses. When he was about 3 meters from the shadow, Morden came to a halt. By now, the soil beneath his feet was surging like waves. "Don't attack just yet. Let's see who it is first," Saul called out from behind. Morden gave a slight nod, and then the soil in front of his feet really did part to the sides like receding waves. The plants rooted in the soil moved aside just as swiftly, driven by the same force. Without taking another step forward, Morden gradually parted the vegetation, obstructing the view of the shadowy figure. Sunlight streamed down from above, finally reaching a corner long hidden in darkness. Saul squinted. At last he saw the figure clearly. And then his pupils widened slightly. "Mark!" As the branches shifted aside with the upheaval of the soil, Saul saw that the unmoving figure beyond was none other than Mark, who hadn't been seen for a very, very long time. Mark had once been a resident senior at Kaz's laboratory, responsible for cleaning and organizing. But later, in an effort to be promoted, he frequently went out. After several changes, the laboratory's manager role had fallen to Angela. When Angela left with Billy, the position became unstable again. Saul encountered someone different every time he visited. Mark didn't respond immediately. He remained standing, facing southeast. Saul knew that was the direction of the wizard tower. Morden turned to look back, awaiting Saul's decision: attack or probe further. Saul took 2 steps forward. When he was within 5 meters of Mark, the man, who had stood as motionless as a statue, suddenly turned his head and looked at him. "I've been waiting for you," Mark said. The moment he moved, every consciousness went on guard. Up until just now, this person hadn't moved at all. There hadn't even been the slightest twitch of muscle from breathing or a heartbeat. He looked like a corpse. But the moment he turned to Saul, it was as if every cell in his body came alive. "You're Mark," Saul narrowed his eyes. He didn't see any abnormal spirit forms on him. "It's me. I'm here to take you in. You can't enter the valley on your own," Mark replied calmly. His face showed no trace of emotion. He looked even more like a vessel than the 4 test subjects beside Saul. "Then who am I?" Saul suddenly asked. Mark fell silent for a moment, his expression still lifeless. After a few seconds, his pale lips parted. "Saul." "How do I know you're really here to take me?" Saul smiled faintly. "I don't just go off with strangers." Mark didn't get angry. He raised his right hand. A mouth split open in his palm. It opened wide, revealing a crimson tongue. The tongue uncurled, and at the center of its tip seemed to be something transparent, unseeable, yet clearly pressing against the tongue, preventing the mouth from closing. "Veiled crystal essence. Brother Saul tilde." Penny began to act coy in a small voice again. "Don't rush." Saul soothed the little butterfly, then stepped forward. All 4 consciousnesses kept their eyes locked on Mark, though their postures didn't convey a sense of immediate danger. "Looks like Kanksha summoned you too," Are there others in the valley? I need to be mentally prepared. As Saul approached, Mark's head slowly rotated to follow him, but his body didn't move an inch. By the time Saul stood beside him, his head had turned a full 90 degrees. The tension in his muscles made his veins pop beneath the skin. Yet Mark's expression remained as calm and cold as ever. Mark Dorothy Monroe. Mark began reciting names one by one. Saul's brow furrowed as soon as he heard the first. As the list grew, so did the tightness in his expression. Until one name made him abruptly interrupt. "Wait, did you say Monroe?" Mark stopped his mechanical recitation and stared blankly at Saul. Then he said, "Yes, Monroe." Monroe. Monroe was in there too. I asked who's in the valley now, not who's been there. Yes, Monroe is in the valley. Monroe had access to veiled crystal essence and could very well have entered Elven Valley with Kongsha. But he had clearly returned to the Wizard Tower and even passed on a message to Saul on her behalf. Yet now Mark claimed Monroe was in the valley. Saul thought back. Mark's first name had been his own. Face darkening, he asked, "Mark, is Mark in the valley too?" "Yes, Mark is also in the valley," Mark answered. Morden sensed something was off. He stepped sideways to shield Saul and said in a low voice, "Master, this man's not right." Saul understood. Morden didn't want him to follow Mark. But right now. Saul glanced around. Though the forest was dense, it didn't obscure too much of the view. The trees stretched all the way to the distant mountains, but there was no sign of any valley terrain. The only valley in this direction would be Hanging Hands Valley to the east. "This is the location Kongsha gave me. Without a guide or a key, we won't be able to enter." "Exactly, exactly," Penny chimed in enthusiastically. She craved the veiled crystal essence the most. Just then Mark spoke again. "Saul is also in the valley." All four consciousnesses turned to look at Saul, amused, yet unnerved. "I'm also in the valley," Saul instinctively asked back. Suddenly, an intense sensation of weightlessness hit them. Everyone felt like they were plunging downward at high speed. Or rather falling. They looked around, down at their feet. Saul's first instinct was to take flight. But even after he rose into the air, the sensation of falling didn't lessen at all. He saw similar flickers of alarm on the others' faces. Yet the scenery around them hadn't changed in the slightest. Saul could still see dust dancing in sunlight, tree leaves swaying in the breeze. "Do you all feel like we're falling?" "Yes, master," came their replies. Especially Herman. His figure was trembling slightly, struggling to stay upright under the sensation of descent. Saul tried closing his eyes. The sensation grew even stronger. He felt suspended midair, with both his brain and eardrums screaming that he was plummeting. But when he opened his eyes, the scene before him was the very image of peaceful tranquility. Is it my brain lying to me, or are my eyes the ones deceiving me? Boom! The freefall sensation stopped abruptly. Everyone except for the stiff, puppet-like Mark lost their footing and fell to the ground. "Cough, cough," and spat out a mouthful of dirt and scrambled up. She craned her neck towards Saul. "Master, are you okay?" Saul had still been hovering a meter off the ground, but the sudden cessation of the weightlessness had shocked his mental strength, causing his spell to falter and drop him. Luckily, the impact was no worse than jumping down from about a meter high. It didn't match the feeling of falling for dozens of seconds straight. Saul hadn't felt this disheveled in a long time. He pushed back his hood, dusted the dirt off his clothes. "I'm fine, are you all okay?" Just moments ago, it had felt like they plummeted from tens of thousands of meters in the sky, yet their bodies hadn't sustained any damage. That contradiction made it impossible to maintain any spells. "Everyone, hold off on using mental strength to probe for now," Saul said as he pushed himself up. We may already be inside Elven Valley, Agu said, having just gotten to his feet as well. Yes, said a voice with a hint of laughter. They turned to see Mark, once stiff as a statue, now wearing a mocking smile. Welcome to the Forest of Seasons. He stretched his arms out wide. The mouths in his palms curled into twisted grins. Chapter 357, An Unexpected Visitor. Not long after Saul entered the Forest of Seasons, a sailboat that traveled across land arrived near Hanging Hands Valley. Captain Wilder of the Land Drifters stood with his arms crossed, his face obscured by a thick beard. His gaze was fixed firmly in the direction Saul's carriage had disappeared. At that moment, one of his men brought over a person cloaked entirely in black to stand behind him. Saul didn't go into Hanging Hands Valley. He went west into the forest, the cloaked figure said in a low, respectful voice, standing a head shorter than Wilder. The voice was barely above a whisper. Wilder frowned. That's the Elven Valley. Few apprentices who enter there ever make it out, who let him go in. The cloaked person lowered their head again. The key to the valley is with Kongsha. That failure, Wilder snorted coldly. And you just let Saul go with her. Why didn't you stop them? Don't you care if Saul gets killed by her? The cloaked figure trembled slightly, as if frightened of Wilder. But Captain, we can't exactly interfere with Saul, can we? At that, Wilder's pupils darted to the edge of his eyes. It's you, HMPH, of course. Only you could get close to him without raising suspicion. The figure under the cloak finally raised their head, but even with the hood lifted, it revealed nothing but pure darkness, no face to be seen. Wilder turned around and dropped his crossed arms. I thought you'd be too busy to show up now. Me? The person suddenly flung back the hood, revealing a head that was just a silhouette of shadow. An experimental subject just has to lie on the bed. What's there to be busy about? You dare remove your hood, Wilder chuckled, his beard trembling slightly at the corners of his mouth. Lady Yura, or should I call you Vinny? As long as Gorsa isn't here, just call me Vinny. I'm not like you people. Yura walked to the edge of the ship, also gazing in the direction Saul had disappeared. I only came to warn you to stay away from Saul. If you're here, that means Gorsa knows exactly where Saul is headed, and he's fine with it. He never interferes. Yura's black silhouette leaned on the railing, part of her arm sinking into the wood. He once acknowledged 3 students. Only Saul did he ever ask me to follow. He's the one Gorsa's intervened with the most with. I never understood why Gorsa suddenly put so much importance on one apprentice. You think I know? Yura gave a low snort. I get the feeling he cares more about Saul than he ever did about the old Yura. Heh, so you who's that? Wilder was about to make another jab when he noticed someone slowly approaching the Land Drifter from the direction of Hanging Hands Valley. That person was already less than 500 meters away before Wilder even noticed them. The smirk froze on his face. You'd better find your own way out. He said this to Yura. A stranger of unknown identity but clearly strong had appeared. Without knowing who the person was, he certainly didn't want to be seen with Yura. Even if Yura had already prepared an excuse for herself, it didn't matter. Some things once caught couldn't be explained, especially with someone as sensitive as Gorsa. Yura, however, simply smiled lightly. Then I'll be off, but don't worry about our connection being exposed. That person is someone I called here to kill you. As she said that, Yura leapt lightly onto the railing and flipped forward a full turn and a half, vanishing into the ground. Not a speck of dust stirred. She vanished directly into the shadow cast by the massive ship. Wilder, you've got to be kidding me. Several cannon ports on the ship's side opened, but instead of cannon barrels, human heads extended out. Those heads shot forward like cannonballs, their necks stretching like ropes behind them. Boom, boom, boom. Head after head slammed into the ground, blasting apart the area where Yura had vanished. But she didn't reappear. Wilder wasn't disappointed. He had only acted in cooperation with Yura's escape. Since she was pretending to flee, it wouldn't make sense if he didn't play along. After that single strike, he raised his hand and signaled a ceasefire, then walked grimly to the other side of the ship. "Who are you? Do not come any closer." By now, a third-rank apprentice sailor was calling out. Finally, someone besides Wilder noticed the mysterious visitor. Everyone on the ship was tense. Before they'd realized someone was there, the person had already nearly reached the ship. And yet the area around Hanging Hands Valley was barren and flat, completely open. The figure drew within 300 meters. One more step and the long shadow ghost heads could attack. But the person stopped just short of that range. Wilder waved off the sailor about to speak again and stared solemnly at the newcomer. "Your strength is considerable, but there's no need to involve yourself in land drifter affairs." Wilder had never seen this person before. He knew every second-rank wizard on the Western continent. This man wasn't anyone he could even guess at. "Sent by someone," the stranger finally spoke. The voice was startlingly pleasant, so pleasant it was hard to tell if it belonged to a man or a woman. "To kill everyone on this ship." Then he lifted his head. "Hiss. Oh my God. Is that even human?" Even these worldly sailors couldn't help but cry out when they saw his face clearly. Even Wilder's eye twitched hard when he saw the stranger's appearance. Not from horror, he wasn't scary. It was because he was too good-looking. How could someone look this good? Wilder had seen plenty of beautiful men and women in his time, and bedded many of them, but none of them looked as unreal as this person. "Stay alert." Suddenly, the first mate, who had the strength of a formal wizard, barked a command. He never covered his face, but only now do we realize how beautiful he is. "That's clearly an illusion spell. Why are you all gawking? Prepare for battle." His words jolted the apprentices back to their senses. Though they were still stunned by the stranger's beauty, they at least began to prepare for a fight. Only Wilder shook his head. He knew it wasn't an illusion. The reason they only just noticed the stranger's appearance, just like how they only noticed he was nearby at the 500-meter mark, was because the stranger had somehow blurred his own presence. Wilder's eyes flickered. He suddenly shouted, "You're a half-elf." At that term, even the most smitten and careless crew members turned tense and alarmed. A half-elf, someone with elven blood. Being around them for too long could drive you mad. Some with weaker mental realms even stumbled back half a step in fear. "What are you afraid of?" the first mate barked again, trying to steady the crew. "A half-elf is no match for the captain. He's probably just a strong first rank." "MHM." The half-elf nodded indifferently, then glanced toward the Elven Valley. "Then let's begin. I'm in a hurry." Chapter 358. Yellow Sparrow, Yellow Sparrow, Yellow Sparrow. Boom! Boom, boom! Several loud explosions erupted in succession from the hull of the floating ship. But the ones who lit the explosives were the very crew members aboard the ship. The first mate, who had just claimed the half-elf was no stronger than a first rank, now stared blankly at the sky, completely indifferent to everything around him. Dozens of crew members ran back and forth across the deck. Some were laughing, some were begging for mercy. One was scrubbing the deck with a blood-stained mop. As someone passed by, their foot slipped, and they plunged headfirst into a wooden bucket filled with red, filthy water. Before he could even struggle to climb out, the mop-wielding crew member, wearing a twisted grin, raised the mop and viciously plunged it into the bucket. A sickening crack like a watermelon splitting rang out, and a cluster of white, unidentifiable objects floated to the surface. The mop-wielding crewman nodded in satisfaction, then pulled the now red and white mop out and continued sliding across the deck. The first mate was still gazing at the sky. He opened his mouth. Inside there was nothing. No tongue, no teeth, no throat, just a writhing mass of red meatballs. A woo-woo-woo sound emanated from within. A panicked crewman accidentally bumped into the first mate and instantly forgot what he had been doing. Mimicking the first mate, he too looked skyward. He stared into the sky, eyes filled with terror, mouth wide open. But before he could let out a second cry, something pierced through his mouth with a squelch, taking with it his lips, teeth, throat, straight through to the end. The fear on the crewman's face vanished. He slowly closed his mouth. A few minutes later, when he opened it again, his organs and muscles had all melted into lumps of flesh, emitting a weeping woo-woo-woo. Another huge explosion sounded. The wooden hull at the ship's bottom burst open, and from within rolled out a massive black sphere 10 meters in diameter. The black ball resembled a tangle of knotted hair, the ends of which were still twitching. It was a grotesque mass formed by the necks of countless slender shadowy wraiths twisted and tangled together. They bit each other fiercely, writhing and contorting, as if locked in a life-or-death battle with hated enemies. From within the black sphere came agonized howls. Humans were going mad, and even the monsters weren't spared. Wilder stood atop the tallest sail, looking down, the corners of his eyes twitching uncontrollably. "I don't know how much Yura paid you, but I can offer more. Stop this corruption, half-elf. This is suicide." He wasn't in good shape either. The skin on the left side of Wilder's face had been torn off, revealing raw, red muscle. The muscle slowly pulsed and regenerated, only to be ripped away again by his own hand. A closer look would show that the red on the left side of his face was far too vivid, less like blood, more like blazing fire, scorching his flesh and nerves. His once thick beard and curly hair had been entirely ripped off. Each time they regrew, Wilder mercilessly tore them out again. That was the most terrifying part. All the injuries were self-inflicted, and the half-elf had only struck once. That one time was when the land drifter's cannonball hit him. The half-elf instantly turned into countless flakes of snow. Thus, in the warmth of spring, a blizzard descended. 10 minutes later, the half-elf stood atop a sail slightly lower than Wilder. Snowflakes still danced around him. These snowflakes would instantly melt upon touching the ship, seemingly harmless, but they were the true cause of the catastrophe. It was from being touched by one such snowflake that Wilder's face was half destroyed. Even now, the corruption there was restless, trying constantly to break through his defenses, to invade his core, to reach his mind and soul. "I don't know who Yura is. I came on Gorsa's behalf." Gorsa, Wilder narrowed his eyes. Though the half-elf's corruption was gnawing at him, he remained calm. After all, to track Saul, this ship was merely a guard vessel in his fleet. If it was destroyed, so be it. As for the crew, Wilder had resolved to sacrifice them all when he signed the three-party agreement. He was, after all, the one meant to serve as the visible enemy and draw enemy fire. This his men didn't know. But if, by drawing fire, he accidentally drew Gorsa himself, that would be too dangerous. At this thought, Wilder no longer spared a glance at the people on board. He soared into the sky, channeling his magic to its limit, enduring the mental pressure from the half-elf, stabilizing his mental form, and flying quickly toward Hanging Hands Valley. Only when the half-elf confirmed that every person aboard had been consumed by his corruption did he slightly turn his head. His entire form scattered into swirling snowflakes, chasing after Wilder. Suddenly, a piercing voice rang out nearby. The sound had such penetrating force that the flurry of snow began to unravel slightly. So the storm reformed into a person. The half-elf looked toward the newcomer who had just prevented his pursuit. "Kismet," his voice was still beautiful, just devoid of emotion. Light flashed, An elegant figure stood atop a massive tree trunk near the ship. Kismet set down his harp and offered a theatrical bow to the half-elf. "An honor that you still remember my name. For that, would you consider sparing Wilder this time? I owe him a life, after all." "Don't believe you," the half-elf said calmly. "Tusk, tusk," Kismet clicked his tongue and changed tack. "Fine, fine, I actually owe him a favor." "Don't believe you." Right, that excuse was lame too. Kismet thought for a moment, then brought his hands together. "Truth is, he's still of some use to me, so he can't die just yet. Could you let him go this once?" That reason seemed a little more believable. The half-elf didn't immediately decide whether to believe it or not. He merely shifted his toes in Kismet's direction. But before he could speak, another voice answered for him. "No." Both Kismet and the half-elf turned to a third direction. A powerful magical aura surged from afar. But in the next instant, Kismet leapt down from the tree, landed lightly on his toes, and darted away, vanishing nearly 100 meters in the blink of an eye. At the same time, a man in a red-brown cloak, Gorsa, appeared in the very spot Kismet had stood. He stared at Kismet but spoke to the half-elf. "Don't forget my commission, half-elf." The half-elf withdrew his foot, which had already shifted direction, and once more turned into a swirling storm of snow, rushing after the fleeing Wilder. Now only Gorsa and Kismet remained. Silver eyes met silver eyes. One gentle, one playful. Suddenly Gorsa moved. He raised his right hand, wrapped in pink bandages, and opened his palm. A black shadow flew out, expanding rapidly like a net, swooping down toward Kismet. The shadow spread swiftly, blanketing the sky above Kismet, as though turning day to night. Kismet instantly tensed. His long fingers plucked rapidly at the harp strings, and he opened his mouth in a silent scream. Clang! As if a mirror had shattered from 100 meters in the air, the black canopy above him fragmented into countless shards and rained down from the sky. Like a storm of black snowflakes. The moment the flakes hit the ground, they darted into the shadows of grass and trees, vanishing without a trace. Kismet's fingers didn't stop even after the dark veil had shattered. The harp's rapid notes sent waves of sound like solid ripples, keeping all the shards at bay. None could approach him or his shadow. Only when every last fragment was gone did Kismet lower his harp. His face had paled several shades, but the smile still hung on his lips. "You really switched to dark element magic. Aren't you afraid of being spanked by your glorious ancestors?" Chapter 359. Are you about to die? Gorsa didn't feel the slightest bit embarrassed when Kismet used the phrase, "spank your butt." In fact, he even chuckled along. "Heh, they've got no time to come over and spank my butt right now." The tension from their earlier standoff, sharp enough to draw blood, vanished the moment they started talking. The two fell into a strange silence again. About a minute passed before Gorsa broke it. "Why are you following Saul?" "Ah, now that's an excuse I need to think carefully about." Kismet cradled his harp but didn't even pause for 3 seconds. "I guess it's because I'm curious about what's happened to him." He seemed to sink into his memories, wearing an intrigued smile. "I've never seen a fate line that twisted before, so I'm curious, what secret is he hiding?" Gorsa's eyes curved like a sly grin. "I've already sent word of you on the western continent back to Skye City. I imagine plenty of people are dying to have a word with you." Kismet's smile disappeared. Gorsa kept piling it on. "Oh, and Lady Orifia also wrote to remind you that it's about time you returned to Skye to see her." The look on Kismet's face was dark enough to drip water. He stared hard at Gorsa for a while before speaking. "As expected of the Glare family's prodigy, your web of connections is wide. Even Orifia is your client." There was obvious mockery beneath his words, but Gorsa had no interest in bickering. He just looked at him with an easygoing smile. Kismet knew he was at a slight disadvantage now. He spun the harp around his fingers and sighed. Fine, you win. What a pity. The tale of the Western continent hasn't even begun and I already have to step off the stage. How dull. To climb up and take in the view, only to turn back just before the sun rises over the sea. My life is always filled with such helplessness. Ah, fate, you press down on me, mocking my struggles, laughing as I sink tilde. He strummed mournfully, singing in a strange tone, and turned to walk toward Hanging Hands Valley. Wind and dust rose, shrouding his silhouette. Gorsa watched Kismet leave the entire time. Only after the figure vanished completely did he suddenly slide down against a tree trunk. He clutched his chest, his body twitching twice before he slowly calmed down. "Are you about to die?" came a clear, pleasant voice from beneath the tree. Gorsa looked down and saw the slightly bedraggled yet still striking half-elf. He didn't answer the question. Instead, he smiled gently and asked, "Did you kill him?" "He ran," the half-elf replied without a care. Gorsa didn't seem disappointed. Wilder used soul devouring flowers, didn't he? "Yeah." "Good. He popped up out of nowhere lately, but I'm in a critical phase and can't afford too much attention on him. If you can't kill him, crippling him for 10 years is enough." "Then I suppose the commission's complete." The half-elf nodded and turned to walk into the woods. Gorsa frowned slightly, pink bandages bunching on his forehead. "You've always avoided the forest of 4 seasons." The half-elf stopped, back still to him. "I don't want to live anymore." He lowered his head, staring at his hands. "The corruption inside me is almost out of control. That fight just now only accelerated the collapse." Gorsa sighed softly. When he asked the half-elf to strike the land drifters, he had already anticipated this would worsen the man's breakdown. He'd expected the half-elf to ask for an outrageous price, but surprisingly, the other agreed immediately. So the truth was, the half-elf had already given up on himself when he agreed to use his power so recklessly to slaughter a vessel. Gorsa understood. The man was simply tired of living. "I heard the ancestors calling me." The half-elf suddenly turned around, letting Gorsa see his face. "Gorsa, this world hates elves. That's not something I can change." The moment Gorsa saw his face, his facial muscles clenched tight. The half-elf noticed the reaction but said nothing. He turned again and continued walking deeper into the woods. "Half-elf, kick Saul out before you die," Gorsa shouted, pressing down his surging chest. His voice shot through the air like an arrow, slicing through vegetation and space alike, landing clearly in the half-elf's ears. The man waved his hand in response. That was enough of a promise. Gorsa let out a breath, seriously. He'd always known the half-elf was beautiful, but no matter how he tried, he could never describe it. He couldn't recall what color his skin was, how many eyes he had, how long his hair was. He only knew that all those features together created a beauty that defied description. Yet such a beautiful being was not even allowed to exist. The half-elf didn't even dare to have a proper name. Though Gorsa was already a second-rank wizard, he still didn't know the true reason the elves had disappeared. After meeting this half-elf, he had his suspicions, but he didn't want to think too hard about them. When the half-elf said the world hated his kind, the harmony and beauty of his features twisted into something terrifying and grotesque. All the lovely words that could describe him were instantly replaced by disgust and horror. Even someone like Gorsa, with top-tier second-rank power, felt nauseated just looking at him, nearly overcome by the urge to kill the man himself, erase him from existence. Thankfully, he restrained that impulse. The implications were too horrific to dwell on. "There's too much unknown in this world. What's one more?" Gorsa knocked on his skull, as if trying to shake loose the memory. "Now let's talk about you." Gorsa suddenly looked down and said. A black shadow, shaped like a small, delicate girl, slid out from his body, paper-thin and trembling in the wind. You were supposed to locate him. Why did you chat with Wilder for so long? Yura's voice came out. I knew him from before. Since he's dying, I just said goodbye. You didn't say anything unnecessary. Yura giggled. Are you mad? Gorsa reached out and stroked her head, his pink fingers sinking into the black shadow and then emerging again. His voice was still gentle as water. Yura, remember, only I will go to any lengths to bring you back. The shadow trembled under his touch, and her laughter cut off instantly. She whispered, I know. Only by completing the resurrection experiment can I live like a real person. Exactly, living like a person, something that used to be so simple. Look at the half-elf. He wants to live like a person too, but his elven blood keeps dragging him into an unknown abyss. Gorsa suddenly pressed hard, forcing Yura back into his body. Once the shadow fully submitted and sank in, he murmured, So you should be grateful. I allow mischief but not betrayal. I understand, came Yura's suppressed voice from his chest. Gorsa smiled in satisfaction, and the next moment, his figure vanished into the forest, as if he'd never been there. Outside the woods, the vessel that had become a hellish battlefield was now freezing over. All the struggling and agony turned to sculpture. And in the end, everything became one enormous ice statue. The sun shone and the temperature rose. Ice and snow began to melt, seeping into the soil, into cracks in the stone, into the spring breeze, absorbed by trees, flowers, grass, and insects. The massive sculpture vanished without a trace. Not even a scrap was left behind. While the outside world seemed peaceful again, Saul could only run through a dense forest on foot. He leapt over bushes and dodged falling branches, sprinting through the ancient woods alongside Mark. And the reason they were running, Mark had suddenly shouted, An elf's coming. Then he dove into the underbrush, leaving behind only one sentence. If you don't want to die, follow me. Chapter 360, Not an Illusion. Without giving him a choice, Mark shoved Saul and ran, warning him that if he wanted to die, he was free to stop. Saul didn't resist. Without knowing the power of the enemy, he wasn't about to be the horror movie cannon fodder who dies deciding whether to flee. Of course, Mark himself wasn't exactly acting normal either, but the energy radiating from him was unmistakably that of a third-rank apprentice. Saul was confident that beating up a third-rank apprentice would still be a piece of cake for him, especially since he had 4 soul bodies alongside him. So even though Saul was currently fleeing in a sorry state, his flight spell only kept him 3 to 5 meters off the ground, while the towering ancient trees around them rose dozens if not hundreds of meters, with chaotic branches and tangled vines. He was surprisingly calm inside. Flying was even slower than running here. The soul bodies behind him followed with blank expressions. They had even less magic stored than Saul, and relied solely on energy to sprint. Too much sprinting, of course, would still burn through magic crystals. While running, Mark specifically warned Saul not to recklessly use mental power here. Saul understood the reasoning. Just now, when he lightly probed Mark's energy waves, his soul body had already begun to tremble. And the tremors hadn't faded with time, they remained steady and constant. Though they didn't currently hinder his spellcasting, if the tremors worsened and didn't recover, Saul knew he'd eventually lose his greatest trump cards, soul fishing and the mental realm. They ran for nearly an hour before stopping to rest on a patch of empty grassland. Even with modified bodies, 2 third-rank wizard apprentices were still left panting and gasping. The vessels remained unbothered. They didn't rely on lungs for running, just energy. Of course, overexertion still meant a drain on magic crystals. Senior Mark, when did you advance to 3rd rank? I haven't had the chance to congratulate you, Saul asked after catching his breath for a few moments. Mark looked over, his expression still animated. There's nothing to congratulate me on. Spend 10 days to half a month in the Elven Valley, and you'll see a big improvement too. Saul had to agree. After that strange moment of weightlessness earlier, he realized that the density of elemental particles in this new world was horrifying, and they were startlingly active. Even without meditating, the particles that resonated with his element were throwing themselves into his body, one after another. Just from the run earlier, he already felt his magic reserves tick up. But Saul was also sure every gift came with a hidden price. This kind of easy upgrade definitely hid massive dangers beneath. When Mark stopped in a sunlit clearing, Saul asked in confusion, "Have we shaken off our pursuer? Isn't this spot too exposed?" Mark chuckled and shook his head. "This is our safe zone. Only in a clearing like this are you safe from suddenly having someone tap you on the shoulder." Saul glanced around the clearing, which barely stretched 5 meters in diameter. Mark reminded him from the side, "Don't get any ideas about cutting trees. If you create your own clearing, you might not be chopping down a tree." Saul turned back, stunned. He had just been thinking that. "You mean what we see in the Elven Valley might not be real?" "No, not hallucinations. The plants, even the grass beneath your feet could be sleeping elves." "Huh?" Saul looked down in shock, lifting his boot and noticing a snapped twig beneath it. "Elves are this cheap. Minor contact and natural breakage isn't a big deal. These plants follow natural laws too: growth, aging, decay. But if you make too much noise or damage, you might wake them up. You saw me opening the path earlier. I never slashed away the vines or branches, did I?" "Is that so?" Saul crouched and picked up the broken twig. The fracture looked normal. The center was pale and tender, the edges gradually darkened and aged into bark. He narrowed his eyes and examined it carefully, but saw nothing unusual. He slowly stood and walked to the edge of the clearing, placing his hand on the trunk of a towering tree. "Careful," Mark reminded him. But Saul wasn't about to blindly follow everything Mark said. He had to see and sense this new world with his own eyes. Otherwise, he'd be led by the nose. Mark seemed to understand Saul's thoughts. He only voiced a reminder but didn't stop him. Saul placed his palm on the bark and examined its texture and branches. Still nothing unusual. But Mark wouldn't give such a flimsy excuse to mess with him. This was the Elven Valley, a place said to have no return. "Senior Mark," Saul said, hand still pressed to the bark, glancing back, "since we're safe for now, can you explain?" His words cut off suddenly, because just then he felt the rough tree bark beneath his hand instantly transform into soft, delicate skin. The sensation was so fleeting that it had already reverted to hard bark before Saul could even react. He jerked his hand back. His fingertips still remembered the warmth and softness of that skin. His heart pounded wildly, and he staggered back 2 steps. "You felt it, didn't you?" Mark asked without mockery. He was the same when he first arrived. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm going mad. Are these towering trees, these flowers and vines, really just elves standing still in various poses? Maybe their eyes are just closed. Maybe when they open them, they'll see us, the intruders in their valley." A trace of fear tinged Mark's voice. Clearly, staying here for so long had taken its toll on his nerves. Agu stepped forward and cautiously examined the tree trunk, but found nothing. "Master?" Agu asked, voice neutral but tinged with doubt. Saul steadied himself. He had to learn to relax here, to accept all these abnormalities as daily occurrences. Only then could he avoid dangerous fluctuations in his mental state. And in the Elven Valley, once mental tremors occurred, they could not be undone. Once calm again, Saul suddenly realized Penny was gone. But he had no way to ask the others if they'd seen her. Once the 4 soul bodies left the mental realm, they entered a semi-independent state. In that state, They couldn't see the nightmare butterfly that existed solely in Saul's vision. "Little Algie," Saul called out. But little Algie only looked around and found nothing. Saul then opened the diary inside his soul body. The silver bookmark had vanished. Still, he felt that if he simply called for Penny, he could forcibly bring her back. But he blinked and didn't do it. Penny surely knew she hadn't escaped the diary's control. If she wasn't showing up now, something must have happened. That might not be a bad thing for Saul. He decided to wait calmly. If Penny sent out a cry for help from the diary, he could pull her back then. He sighed deeply, making it look like he was just recovering from the shock. "Senior Mark, let's continue our conversation." Mark understood and nodded, sitting cross-legged and trying to relax his limbs. Saul followed suit. The four soul bodies remained standing, as if on alert. Mark looked around at the four of them and sighed. "No wonder you're the Tower Master's personal apprentice. You even get bodyguards when you go out." Saul didn't explain, and Mark let it go with a single remark. "I've been through a lot these past few months. Where should I start?" Saul locked eyes with him. "Start with that strange state you were in outside the Elven Valley, and why you returned to normal once you entered."